There is a place in the North Atlantic where the water is so deep and so cold and so far from any shore that a ship sunk there will fall for minutes before it comes to rest on the bottom. The men inside it, if any survived the initial explosion, would not survive the descent. The ocean keeps its secrets in that darkness. It has kept them for more than 80 years now. During the Second World War, the waters of the Atlantic Ocean became the site of the longest continuous military campaign of the entire conflict. Not a single battle with a beginning and an end, but a relentless grinding war that lasted from the first days of September 1939 until the very last hours before Germany's surrender in May 1945. 5 years and 8 months of hunting, of hiding, of sinking, and of drowning. A war conducted mostly out of sight, mostly in silence, in a place where no correspondent could follow and no photographer could document what was really happening beneath the waves. The men who fought it on the German side did so inside steel cylinders no wider than a suburban hallway. They slept in shifts because there were not enough bunks for every man aboard. They breathed recycled air that tasted of diesel and sweat, and the particular anxiety of a crew that understood, with complete clarity, that the sea pressing against the hull on all sides would kill them without hesitation if given even the smallest opportunity. They operated under conditions that would challenge the psychological endurance of almost any human being, and many of them did not come home. And yet, from within that world of compressed air and constant danger, individual men rose to a kind of terrible prominence. Men whose names were celebrated in German newspapers, whose faces appeared on propaganda postcards, whose tactical instincts made them genuinely feared by the Allied merchant sailors and naval escorts they hunted across thousands of miles of open ocean. They were called aces, a word borrowed from aviation, applied here to commanders who had achieved confirmed kills above a certain threshold. Men who had demonstrated not just courage, but the specific, lethal skill of finding prey in the vastness of the Atlantic and destroying it. Jochen Mohr was one of those men. His story is not the most famous story of the U-boat war. He is not the name that appears first in general histories, not the commander whose memoir was translated into a dozen languages, or whose patrols formed the centerpiece of the most celebrated post-war accounts. He occupies a particular position in that history, skilled enough to be genuinely dangerous, experienced enough to have learned the trade at its most punishing, human enough to have understood what was happening around him as the war turned against Germany, and the men in the steel cylinders began dying faster than they could be replaced. What makes his story worth telling, and worth telling carefully, is precisely that combination of professional competence and historical tragedy. He was good at something that was, ultimately, part of a catastrophic and morally indefensible war. He served a regime whose crimes place it beyond any ordinary historical rehabilitation. And he operated in a campaign that killed tens of thousands of merchant sailors, men who were not soldiers, men who were simply trying to move food and fuel and materials across an ocean that had suddenly become a killing ground. These are not comfortable facts to sit with. This documentary does not ask you to set them aside. What it asks instead is that you follow the full arc of one man's experience through one of history's most brutal naval campaigns, and that you look honestly at what that experience reveals about the nature of submarine warfare, about the capacity of human beings to continue functioning under extremes of fear and physical hardship, about the way that tactical skill and strategic catastrophe can coexist in the same story, and about what it means to be a professional in service of a cause that history has thoroughly condemned. Because the U-boat war was precisely that kind of story. The men who fought it on the German side were not, for the most part, ideological fanatics. They were sailors. Many of them were very young. They had been trained to operate a specific kind of weapon in a specific kind of environment, and they did so with a discipline and effectiveness that Allied naval commanders had to take seriously even as they were working to defeat it. The campaign they conducted came within a measurable distance of strangling Britain's capacity to continue the war. Had it succeeded, the history of the 20th century would look very different. It did not succeed, and the reasons why it failed, the breaking of German naval codes, the development of airborne radar, the extension of air cover across the mid-Atlantic gap, the refinement of convoy escort tactics, form a story of Allied ingenuity and determination that runs parallel to every patrol, every sinking, every narrow escape that defines Jochen Mohr's individual history. To understand one man's war, you have to understand both sides of it. So settle in. If you are watching this at the end of a long day, if the room around you is quiet and the world outside has gone still, then you have found perhaps the right frame of mind for this kind of history. The story of the Atlantic campaign is one that rewards patience. It unfolded slowly, over years, in increments that were sometimes invisible from the outside. A convoy arrived safely. A U-boat did not return to port. A commander filed a report that was read by admirals in a bunker and then filed in an archive where it would sit, undisturbed, for decades. We will move through that story carefully and completely, from the strategic foundations that made the U-boat war possible, through Jochen Mohr's earliest years and his path into the Kriegsmarine, through the commissioning of his vessel and his first uncertain patrols, through his most successful operations and his closest escapes, through the long decline that swallowed the German submarine arm and the men inside it, all the way to the final weeks of a war that had already been decided, and the question of what becomes of a commander when the mission he was built for has ceased to have any meaning. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists to tell stories like this one. Long, careful, fully researched stories about the human experience of war, told without glorification and without simplification. If you find value in that kind of storytelling, then subscribing is the best way to make sure these documentaries continue to be made and continue to find the audience they deserve. And if you have been here before, then you already know what comes next. The water is very cold in the North Atlantic. It has always been cold, and somewhere out there, in depths where light has never reached, the evidence of what happened in those years still rests on the ocean floor. The hulls of merchant ships, the scattered debris of convoys that never reached port, and somewhere among them, the remains of U-boats that went down and never came back up. This is the world Jochen Mohr entered when he went to sea. This is where we begin. Somewhere beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, in water cold enough to stop a man's heart within minutes, a steel cylinder roughly 67 meters long would slip silently through the dark. No sunlight reached it, no sound carried to it except the groan of pressure and the distant percussion of propellers churning above. Inside, 40 or 50 men breathed recycled air, sweated through wool uniforms, and waited. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were hunters, patient, methodical, and utterly dependent on the sea remaining ignorant of their presence. This was the world of the German U-boat, and before we can understand the man who would one day command one, we must first understand the ocean that shaped him, the war that called for him, and the weapon that would define his brief and violent career. When Germany went to war in September of 1939, it did so with a submarine fleet that was, by any honest accounting, dangerously small. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander who would become the architect of the Atlantic campaign, had argued for years that Germany needed hundreds of operational U-boats to strangle British commerce effectively. What he received at the outbreak of hostilities was a fraction of that number, fewer than 60 submarines in total, with only a portion of those capable of sustained Atlantic operations. The gap between strategic ambition and material reality would haunt the German submarine arm throughout the war. But in those early months, what Dönitz lacked in quantity, he attempted to compensate for through audacity, positioning, and the careful selection of aggressive young commanders willing to push their boats and their crews to the absolute limit. Britain's vulnerability was not a secret. The island nation imported the vast majority of its food, fuel, and raw materials by sea, and the Atlantic shipping lanes that connected it to North America, West Africa, and beyond were its circulatory system. Cut those lanes, and Britain would not merely suffer, it would begin to die. German naval planners understood this with clinical clarity, and so did Winston Churchill, who would later write that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. The arithmetic was straightforward and brutal. If German submarines could sink Allied merchant vessels faster than the shipyards of Britain and America could replace them, the war in the West was effectively over before a single soldier crossed the English Channel. The battle for the Atlantic was, at its core, a race between destruction and production, and the men who fought it understood that economics, not heroism, would determine its outcome. The early months of the war gave Germany reasons for optimism that would prove misleading. British anti-submarine defences in 1939 were significantly weaker than German planners had feared, and U-boat commanders exploited this with spectacular results. The convoy system, which had proven effective in the First World War, had been slow to reinstate, and German submarines found unescorted merchant ships as vulnerable as they were valuable. These early successes created a culture of confidence within the U-boat arm, a sense that the submarine was an almost perfect weapon, difficult to detect, easy to conceal, and capable of delivering devastating blows before vanishing into the deep. That confidence was not entirely unjustified, but it masked technical vulnerabilities and operational limitations that would become catastrophically apparent as the war deepened and Allied countermeasures evolved. The technology of submarine warfare in 1939 occupied a curious middle ground between the primitive and the sophisticated. A German U-boat of that era was faster on the surface than submerged, which meant that much of its operational life was spent riding the swells like any other vessel, exposed to the same weather, the same visibility, and the same dangers as the ships it hunted. Submerged, it relied on battery power, which was limited and required regular recharging on the surface. This fundamental dependence on the surface world was both the U-boat's tactical reality and its greatest vulnerability, because any technology that could detect a submarine while it recharged its batteries or maneuvered at night could reduce the weapon's effectiveness to almost nothing. The British knew this, and they began investing in exactly those technologies from the very first months of the conflict. ASDIC, the British underwater sound detection system known more broadly as sonar, had existed in rudimentary form since the First World War, and British escort vessels carried increasingly refined versions of it into the early Atlantic battles. It worked by emitting pulses of sound and listening for the echo returned by a submerged hull. In calm water, against a stationary or slow-moving target, it was reasonably effective. Against a maneuvering submarine in rough Atlantic seas, its limitations were significant, and experienced U-boat commanders learned quickly how to use speed changes, depth adjustments, and thermal layers in the water column to confuse it. But ASDIC was only the beginning. The British were simultaneously developing radar systems capable of detecting a surfaced submarine at night, long before a human lookout could spot the approaching vessel. That development, when it matured, would change the character of the Atlantic War more profoundly than any tactical innovation on either side. Dönitz's answer to improving British defences was the Wolfpack, a coordinated system of attacks in which multiple U-boats would converge on a single convoy simultaneously, overwhelming the escort's ability to respond to threats from multiple directions at once. The logic was elegant. A single U-boat attacking a well-defended convoy might be located, depth-charged, and driven off or destroyed. 10 U-boats attacking from different bearings, feeding position reports to each other through encrypted radio traffic, and striking at different points in the convoy's defensive perimeter, created a chaos that even skilled escort commanders struggled to manage. Wolfpack tactics required precise coordination, disciplined radio communication, and commanders willing to hold back their attacks until the pack was fully assembled. A test of patience that not every young U-boat captain was temperamentally suited to pass. Those who could exercise that restraint, who could submerge and shadow a convoy for hours or days without breaking position, tended to survive longer and achieve more. Those who could not often did not return from their second or third patrol. The shipyards of Germany worked throughout the early war years to expand the fleet that Dönitz had argued for and never fully received before the conflict began. The Type 7, in various sub-variants, emerged as the standard attack submarine of the Kriegsmarine, the vessel around which operational doctrine was built, and upon which the entire Atlantic campaign would ultimately depend. It was not the largest submarine in the German inventory, nor the most technologically advanced. What it was practical, reliable enough to send young crews into the North Atlantic on patrol cycles that lasted weeks, rugged enough to absorb punishment that might have destroyed less carefully engineered vessels, and simple enough in its systems that a well-trained crew could effect emergency repairs without shore support. The Type 7 was a weapon designed to be used repeatedly and aggressively, and the German Navy used it accordingly, losing crews and boats at a rate that would have shocked the admirals of an earlier generation, but continuing to press the campaign with an operational tempo that the Allies found genuinely alarming well into 1942. The American entry into the war following December of 1941 created an unexpected gift for Dönitz. The eastern seaboard of the United States was, in the first months of 1942, lit like a carnival. Cities refused to enforce blackouts. Ships sailed independently without convoy escort, and the United States Navy, proud and initially dismissive of hard-won British experience, was slow to adopt the convoy system that its ally had painfully relearned. German U-boat commanders operating in American waters during this period described the ease of their attacks with a mixture of amazement and something close to discomfort. Merchant ships were silhouetted against the glow of coastal cities, making them easy targets at night. Rescue operations were predictable and could themselves be targeted. The period that German submariners called their second happy time inflicted catastrophic losses on Allied shipping and temporarily reversed the momentum that British anti-submarine measures had been slowly, painfully building. It was a window that would close, but while it remained open, the U-boat arm seized every opportunity it offered. By the time the window began to close, as American convoy systems organized, as Allied patrol aircraft extended their range, as the technological competition between hunter and hunted accelerated into a sprint, the Atlantic had already consumed thousands of sailors on both sides and tens of millions of tons of cargo. The strategic calculus that had seemed straightforward in 1939 had revealed its terrible complexity. Sinking ships was not enough if replacement hulls came off the ways faster than submarines could destroy them. Strangling supply lines was not enough if the production capacity of North American industry could absorb the losses and continue delivering equipment to Britain at a rate that kept the island nation fighting. The U-boat arm was inflicting wounds, serious and genuine wounds, but it was not delivering the killing blow that Dönitz had promised Hitler, and as Allied countermeasures improved and German losses began rising toward levels that threatened the arm's ability to sustain operations at all, the strategic picture darkened in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse. It was into this world, already complex, already brutal, already beginning its long tilt away from German advantage and toward Allied supremacy, that Jochen Mohr would arrive. He was not among the first generation of U-boat commanders, the men who had ridden the early waves of success and built their reputations in waters still learning to defend themselves. He came later, when the lessons had hardened and the margins had narrowed, when a commander's skill was measured not only by the tonnage he sent to the bottom, but by his ability to bring his crew home alive from an ocean that had learned, slowly and at tremendous cost, how to fight back. The war that awaited him was not the war that had greeted his predecessors. It was harder, colder, and significantly less forgiving, and the men who survived it long enough to matter were those who understood, in their bones, through training and temperament alike, that the sea was neutral, the enemy was learning, and the steel tube that kept them alive was the thinnest possible membrane between a man and the absolute dark. That understanding, and what Mohr did with it, is where this story truly begins. Germany between the wars was a nation learning to breathe through a broken chest. The armistice of 1918 had not simply ended a conflict, it had dismantled an identity. The Kaiser's navy, once the pride of a rising industrial empire, lay scuttled at Scapa Flow, its warships resting on the seabed like monuments to humiliation. The Weimar Republic that rose from the wreckage inherited a country stripped of territory, saddled with reparations that ground the economy to dust, and haunted by a military tradition it was no longer permitted to fully express. Into this fractured world, Jochen Mohr was born, shaped not by triumph, but by the long, unsteady shroud of defeat. The Germany he grew up in was a country searching for itself, and the young men who came of age within it were searching too. His family background placed him in the respectable middle of German society, the kind of household where duty and discipline were not simply values but daily rhythms. The Mohr family was not aristocratic, not connected to the old Prussian military nobility that had dominated the officer class for generations, yet neither were they outsiders to the idea of service. In the Germany of the 1920s, such families occupied an anxious position, educated enough to feel the national humiliation acutely, grounded enough to seek stability through institution and structure. The naval tradition held particular resonance in a household like his. The sea offered something the land could not quite promise in those turbulent years, a form of order that existed beyond the reach of street politics and collapsing currencies. It was a world of technical mastery, of hierarchy that made sense, of purpose that felt immune to the chaos of the Republic's struggling democracy. Mohr's early schooling unfolded during years when the German classroom itself was a contested space, textbooks that glorified the old empire sitting uneasily alongside a republic that many teachers privately despised. He was, by available accounts, a composed and attentive student, the kind of boy who absorbed information methodically rather than brilliantly. who earned respect through consistency rather than flash. Physical discipline came naturally to him. The sea had not yet called in any specific way, but the instinct for structured endeavor, for problems that could be solved through preparation and patience, was already visible in the young man taking shape. Germany in the late 1920s was simultaneously collapsing and straining towards something new, and young men like Mohr existed at that precise, uncomfortable intersection between the world their fathers had known and the world hurtling toward them. The global economic catastrophe that arrived at the end of the 1920s struck Germany with particular savagery. Unemployment rose to levels that dissolved ordinary life at its foundations. Political extremism did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from genuine desperation, from a middle class watching its savings evaporate, from young men with no employment and no prospect of any. The Weimar Republic's institutions bent and then buckled. For a young man contemplating his future in the early 1930s, the military offered something that the civilian economy increasingly could not: certainty, belonging, and the promise of advancement through merit rather than inheritance or luck. The Kriegsmarine, the small, treaty-limited naval force permitted to Germany under the Versailles restrictions, represented exactly this kind of refuge. It was disciplined, professional, and quietly rebuilding itself in ways the treaty's architects had not fully anticipated. When Mohr presented himself for naval service, he was entering an institution that was itself in the middle of a profound transformation. The Versailles Treaty had capped Germany's navy at a fraction of its former strength. No submarines, no battleships beyond a modest tonnage limit. A force that looked like a coast guard wearing the uniform of a fleet. But the men running that diminished navy had never accepted the limitations as permanent. Training continued at a depth that far exceeded what the treaty intended. Officers studied submarine warfare in ways that were technically prohibited, maintaining the institutional memory of the underwater campaign even when the vessels themselves could not legally exist. By the time Mohr arrived, Adolf Hitler had come to power, and the quiet rebuilding had begun to accelerate into something openly defiant. The Kriegsmarine, the name itself a departure from the Republic's more neutral Reichsmarine, was coming into being around him as he trained. Basic naval training in the Kriegsmarine demanded a particular kind of endurance. The German naval education system of this period was rigorous in ways that were specifically designed to sort candidates by temperament as much as by ability. Sleep deprivation, physical demands, navigation exercises conducted in genuine weather. The system was not simply building sailors, but constructing officers who could function under sustained stress without losing their capacity for rational judgment. Mohr proved steady through this process in the way that would come to define him throughout his career. He was not the recruit who made the loudest impression, who dominated the classroom or the parade ground with obvious brilliance. He was instead the one who was still standing, still thinking clearly, still making sound decisions when others had begun to fray. His early training brought him into contact with the full range of naval surface operations before the submarine arm became his specific domain. He learned navigation aboard surface vessels, understood the mechanics of fleet coordination, absorbed the tactical principles that governed naval engagement. This broader foundation would matter later, in ways that a narrower submarine-only education could not have provided. An officer who understood how escort commanders thought, who had studied the surface navy from inside its own traditions, would carry a distinct advantage once he descended beneath the waves to work against those very same vessels. The understanding was not merely technical but almost intuitive. He knew the rhythms of the enemy because he had trained within a related rhythm himself. The submarine arm that Mohr eventually gravitated toward was, in the mid-1930s, both an exciting frontier and a profoundly demanding one. Karl Dönitz, the officer who would shape the entire U-boat campaign, was already building his force with a missionary's intensity. Dönitz believed in the submarine not simply as a weapon, but as the decisive weapon, the instrument that could strangle Britain's Atlantic lifeline and force the war's conclusion in Germany's favor. He was recruiting men of a particular type, technically capable, psychologically durable, comfortable with the claustrophobic reality of extended submersion, and possessed of an aggressive confidence that could survive the weeks of boredom and minutes of terror that submarine operations alternately demanded. Mohr, in his composed and methodical way, fit the profile, even if he did not radiate the swaggering confidence that some of Dönitz's more celebrated early commanders projected. The submarine training itself was a world apart from anything surface naval service had prepared him for. The mechanics of a U-boat, the trim, the dive, the management of compressed air, the delicate arithmetic of battery life and oxygen consumption, demanded a different kind of attention than surface navigation. Errors aboard a surface vessel could sometimes be corrected. Errors aboard a submarine, particularly during an engagement or a depth charge attack, could be irreversible within seconds. Training drilled this reality into candidates through repetition that bordered on the obsessive. Emergency procedures were rehearsed until they became reflexive, because the moment when they would actually be needed would leave no time for conscious thought. Mohr absorbed these disciplines with the same methodical patience that had carried him through his earlier training. Not gifted, but thorough. Not dazzling, but reliable in exactly the way the job required. Alongside the technical education ran something harder to quantify: the formation of a commander's character. The Kriegsmarine's officer culture of this period carried expectations that went beyond technical competence. A U-boat commander was expected to exercise independent judgment at distances from headquarters where radio contact might be impossible or dangerous. He had to make decisions about attack, withdrawal, and crew safety in conditions of radical uncertainty, with incomplete information and no guarantee of support. The training system could teach procedures, but the underlying disposition, the combination of nerve and restraint that distinguished a successful commander from a reckless one, had to come from somewhere deeper. In Mohr's case, it seemed to emerge from the same middle-class sense of measured responsibility that had shaped his earliest years. He was not indifferent to risk, but he was not seduced by it either. By the time the war began in September of 1939, Mohr was a formed naval officer, not yet a commander, not yet the figure the Atlantic would eventually know, but recognizably himself. The years of training had refined rather than transformed him. The composure was more disciplined now, the technical knowledge vastly deeper, the understanding of leadership sharpened by the specific demands of submarine service. He had watched the opening months of the war as more senior commanders launched the first U-boat campaigns against British shipping, reading the early lessons with the attention of a man who knew his own moment was approaching. The war had begun. The Atlantic was already becoming the arena that would define the conflict's outcome. And somewhere within the Kriegsmarine's expanding submarine fleet, Jochen Mohr was waiting for the command that would send him down beneath the surface of that grey, unforgiving ocean. What those early years had built, in the end, was not a man who burned for glory or thirsted for the kind of competitive kills race that drove some of his contemporaries toward recklessness. They had built something perhaps more dangerous in a sustained campaign, a professional. A man who understood that survival and effectiveness were not opposites but complements, that a submarine still afloat and still fighting was worth more to the campaign than a dead hero. It was a philosophy forged in the difficult decades that had produced him, born of a Germany that had already learned, at enormous cost, what happened when ambition outran patience. The Atlantic would test that philosophy against every form of pressure the enemy could bring to bear. But before it could be tested, it first had to be earned, one careful year at a time. Before a man could be trusted with a crew, before he could be handed the responsibility of a vessel and the lives that depended on her, the Kriegsmarine required him to be broken down and rebuilt. Not in the sense of cruelty, though the training was demanding enough, but in the sense of reconditioning. Every instinct a young officer had developed on the surface, the reliance on horizon, on sky, on open air, had to be methodically replaced. Jochen Mohr entered this process, as most junior officers did, with ambition that outpaced his knowledge, and with the understanding that patience was not optional. The training establishment that received him was thorough, unhurried, and deeply serious about what it was producing. The Atlantic was waiting, and the Atlantic did not forgive errors made by half-prepared men. The earliest phase placed him aboard boats he had not yet earned the right to command, in a role that was specifically designed to strip away any illusions about what submarine service actually demanded. As a watch officer under experienced captains, his responsibilities were both technical and observational. He was expected to absorb everything: how a seasoned commander read a convoy's silhouette, how he judged the angle of approach, how he weighed the mathematics of a torpedo solution against the rolling uncertainty of a dark North Atlantic swell. These captains were not warm tutors. They were men shaped by operational pressure, and their instruction was delivered in a language of correction more often than praise. For Mohr, who had shown a natural facility for detail, this environment was less punishing than it might have been for others. He listened carefully, he made notes, he asked questions at times considered appropriate, and held his silence when they were not. The submarines themselves during this training period were older and smaller than the vessels already earning recognition in the operational fleet. Working in cramped compartments with reduced crew complements and equipment that required constant manual attention, junior officers like Mohr were forced to develop a physical fluency with the machinery that no classroom could have taught. Trim calculations, ballast adjustments, the sequencing of a crash dive, these were not procedures one could afford to perform slowly. The training commands expected their officers to achieve reliable speed in these actions until the movements became automatic, until the hands could find the right valve in darkness, and the mind could hold multiple system states simultaneously without losing composure. Mohr earned, in this period, the particular kind of competence that comes only from repetition so thorough it ceases to be conscious. What the training flotillas also taught, quietly and without formal instruction, was the psychology of confinement. A submarine at depth is among the most psychologically demanding environments a human being can occupy. The noise does not stop, the hum of motors, the creak of the hull adjusting to pressure, the sounds carried through the water that the crew learned to categorize and interpret. Sleep came in short cycles on shared bunks that never fully cooled before the next man occupied them. Privacy was an abstraction. Personal space did not exist. The culture of the submarine arm demanded that officers not merely tolerate these conditions, but appear indifferent to them, because visible discomfort was corrosive to the men below them. Mohr developed in this period the kind of outward steadiness that would later become a defining characteristic of his command style, a quietness that his crews would interpret as confidence, because the alternative interpretation was too unsettling to consider. His advancement through the officer grades during this training period followed the Kriegsmarine's structured progression, which was neither accelerated nor delayed in his case. He served in the capacity of second watch officer aboard training flotilla boats, accumulating the documented sea hours required before the Navy would consider him for a first watch officer posting. This was not a period of glory, and he would not have expected it to be. The men who had gone before him and were already making names in operational waters had passed through the same corridors, made the same mistakes in the same training exercises, and absorbed the same corrections. What varied was the quality of attention a man brought to it, and whether the lessons accumulated into genuine competence or merely into the documentation of having been present. There was, in the culture of the submarine training arm, a particular respect for tactical thinking that went beyond mechanical proficiency. A boat's captain had to be not only a skilled operator but a hunter, someone capable of building a mental picture from incomplete information, of constructing an attack solution from the fragments available in darkness and sea state and enemy movement. The training exercises that simulated convoy attacks were deliberately imperfect, with information withheld and scenarios altered without warning, because the operational reality they were preparing men for was equally imperfect. Mohr showed, during these exercises, a notable ability to adapt. When a simulated target changed course, or an exercise controller introduced an unexpected escort response, he recalculated without the visible frustration that caused others to rush their decisions or abandon a developing approach. His instructors observed this. Their evaluations reflected it. It would be inaccurate to present this training period as uniformly smooth or uneventful. There were exercises that went poorly, decisions made under pressure that later analysis revealed as errors, and the particular humiliation of being corrected in front of a crew that had been watching closely. These moments were not insignificant. They were, in the philosophy of the training flotillas, the point. The submarine arm could not afford officers who learned only from success, because operational patrols would not consistently offer success as a teacher. The capacity to absorb a failure, understand its mechanics, and adjust without carrying the weight of it forward was a quality the training process actively selected for. Whether Mohr possessed this quality naturally or developed it through the discipline of the training environment is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that he emerged from the process with it. During his time in the training flotillas, the broader war in the Atlantic was accelerating toward the period of German dominance that would later be called the happy time, though the men conducting it rarely used that term in the way it would later be romanticized. For officers still in training, monitoring the operational reports filtering back to the naval establishment was a complicated experience. These accounts described patrols that seemed to belong to a different war than the methodical exercises being run in the training grounds. Senior commanders were achieving kill tallies that reshaped strategic calculations, and their names were becoming familiar to anyone who followed the fleet bulletins. For a junior officer in a training flotilla, this created a tension between the patience the system demanded and the ambition that had drawn him to the submarine arm in the first place. Mohr navigated this tension by, as far as the record suggests, concentrating on what was in front of him rather than what was happening without him. The transition from training postings to operational consideration required not only the completion of required hours and examinations, but a recommendation from senior officers who had observed the candidate directly. This was a system that depended heavily on personal impression, on whether a man's superiors believed he had the particular combination of qualities the role demanded. Technical proficiency could be documented, but judgment could only be estimated. Steadiness under simulated pressure could only be extrapolated toward what it might become under the real kind. The officers who recommended Jochen Mohr for advancement toward command were making a professional bet, based on observation rather than certainty. The bet, as subsequent events would demonstrate, was not poorly placed. By the time he was approaching the threshold of his own command, Mohr had spent enough time in the machine to understand it from the inside rather than from description. He had stood watch in weather that made the simplest navigation laborious. He had held a boat's trim through exercises that made the actual demands of the Atlantic feel, at least in structure if not in scale, familiar. He had read the technical literature the Navy produced on British anti-submarine developments, on the improvements to destroyer-mounted sonar, on the aircraft that were beginning to complicate what had once been relatively unchallenged ocean access. This last category of reading would have concentrated his thinking considerably. The window of operational advantage that the U-boat arm had enjoyed in the early years of the war was already, for those paying attention, beginning to narrow. Mohr was paying attention. The training years left him with something that could not be manufactured quickly and could not be borrowed from another man's experience. It was the specific confidence of someone who had been tested repeatedly against fixed standards, found adequate by those standards, and refined through correction until the gaps in his knowledge were small enough to be manageable. It was not arrogance. Arrogance was a quality the submarine arm tended to correct quickly and often permanently. It was, instead, a quiet assurance about his own preparation. The ocean ahead of him was genuinely dangerous, and the war ahead was genuinely uncertain. But the man walking toward his first command was not the same man who had arrived at the training establishment with ambition in excess of knowledge. That gap had been methodically closed. What remained was to discover what he would do with what he had become. To understand what Jochen Mohr would one day command, you first have to understand the machine itself. The Type 7C was not a revolutionary design. It was not born from some sudden leap of engineering genius. It was something more enduring than that. A refined, hardened, relentlessly practical weapon, shaped by the accumulated failures and hard lessons of an earlier generation of submariners. The Germans had been building submarines since the First War, and each successive class carried forward what worked and discarded what had killed men unnecessarily. By the time the Type 7C reached full production, it represented 2 decades of institutional knowledge compressed into a hull roughly 67 meters from bow to stern. It was the distilled product of a navy that had learned, above all else, how to lose expensive equipment and replace it quickly. The dimensions tell part of the story. 67 meters long and just under 6 meters at its widest beam, the Type 7C was not a large vessel by any measure. Placed alongside a convoy merchant ship, it would have looked almost modest, almost inadequate to the task assigned to it. Displacement when surfaced sat at approximately 760 tons, rising to roughly 865 tons when fully submerged and carrying its full load of ballast water. For comparison, a standard British destroyer of the same era displaced well over 1,000 tons and towered above the waterline with armaments that dwarfed anything the U-boat could muster in a surface exchange. Yet the Type 7C was not built to fight destroyers on the surface. It was built to slip beneath them, unseen and patient, and strike the vessels they were sworn to protect. 2 diesel engines drove the boat when it ran on the surface, generating together roughly 2,800 horsepower and pushing it to a maximum speed of approximately 17 knots under ideal conditions. Submerged, the picture changed entirely. The diesels were useless underwater. They consumed oxygen the crew needed to breathe, so the boat switched to electric motors, drawing power from a bank of batteries housed beneath the crew's feet. Those motors produced a fraction of the surface power. limiting submerged speed to around 7.5 knots at best, and a patrol crawl of considerably less when conserving battery life. The contrast between surface capability and submerged performance was one of the defining tactical tensions of U-boat warfare. Surface speed gave mobility, the ability to run ahead of convoys and reposition for attack. Submerged endurance gave survival. Every commander had to balance the two with care, because running the diesels too long in daylight could mean visibility, detection, and death. The weapons arrangement followed a straightforward logic that reflected the submarine's fundamental purpose. 4 torpedo tubes sat forward in the bow, clustered together behind the pressure hull's rounded nose, each capable of launching a standard torpedo roughly 7 meters long and weighing close to 1,500 kilograms. A single additional tube was mounted aft, offering a rearward shot for moments when a target presented itself from behind or when an attacking escort closed too quickly to engage from the front. The boat carried 14 torpedoes in total on a standard patrol, with the spare weapons stowed beneath deck grating and in cramped compartments that ate into the already minimal living space. Beyond torpedoes, a deck gun was mounted forward of the conning tower, an 88mm weapon in earlier production runs, though this was progressively supplemented and later replaced on many boats with enhanced anti-aircraft armament as Allied air power over the Atlantic grew more threatening. The gun was never the primary weapon, but it served a particular purpose, finishing off damaged merchant vessels without expending a scarce torpedo on a hull already sinking. Life aboard a Type 7C was an exercise in managed discomfort that bordered on suffering during extended patrols. The pressure hull offered roughly 240 cubic meters of usable interior space, distributed across several compartments that served simultaneously as workspace, sleeping quarters, weapons storage, and machinery room. A crew of roughly 44 to 52 men shared this volume for patrols lasting weeks or months, rotating through bunks in a practice the sailors called hot bunking, one man rising for watch as another slid into the still warm sleeping space he had vacated. Fresh water was rationed to the point where washing became a luxury reserved for the lucky or the ranking. The air inside grew thick and stale within hours of diving, rich with the smell of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint metallic bite of the machinery surrounding them. The psychological pressure of that confinement, layered over the constant knowledge that the steel walls around you might at any moment become your coffin, was something training could only partially prepare a man for. Operationally, the Type 7C's greatest strength was its range. Carrying approximately 113 tons of fuel oil, the boat could cover roughly 8,500 nautical miles at an economical surface speed, a reach that placed it firmly in the mid-Atlantic and, with careful fuel management, along the American eastern seaboard and into Caribbean waters. This range had been deliberately engineered after the lessons of the First War, when German submarines had struggled to maintain sustained pressure on British supply lines due to the distance between their home ports and the critical shipping lanes. With the fall of France in 1940, the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm gained access to bases at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, French Atlantic ports that shortened transit time dramatically and effectively extended the operational reach of every boat in the fleet without any change to the design itself. The Type 7C had been built with forward basing in mind, and when that basing became reality, the submarine's geometry of threat expanded almost overnight. The boat's diving capability was another central element of its tactical value. Certified to a test depth of approximately 220 meters, with many commanders pushing beyond that figure when survival demanded it. The Type 7C could place itself in water column deep enough to complicate the geometry of a depth charge attack significantly. Allied depth charges of the early war years carried a lethal radius of perhaps 4 to 5 meters, a frighteningly small margin that demanded extraordinary accuracy in the attacker. A boat at depth, twisting through course changes, varying speed, and using thermocline layers in the water to scatter sonar returns, was a genuinely difficult target to kill. This gave commanders an important psychological asset alongside the physical one, the knowledge that depth brought time, and time brought options. The tactical doctrine built around the Type 7C evolved through the early war years into the Wolfpack system that would make the Battle of the Atlantic one of the most bitterly contested campaigns in modern naval history. Individual boats were assigned to patrol lines spread across hundreds of kilometers of ocean, each submarine serving as both a sensor and a weapon. When one boat made contact with a convoy, it surfaced in darkness or submerged to maintain tracking, radioing position and course to fleet headquarters at Lorient, while other boats in the patrol line converged. The genius of the system was its exploitation of the Type 7C's surface speed for repositioning and its submerged capability for the final attack. The convoy escort, designed to fight submarines that attacked from predictable angles, found itself facing threats from multiple directions simultaneously, some attacking submerged from the flanks, others running ahead on the surface at night to attack from ahead. The Type 7C had not created this doctrine, but its particular combination of speed, range, and weapons load had made it possible. There were limitations that no amount of tactical cleverness could fully compensate for, and commanders who ignored those limitations tended not to survive long enough to learn from their mistakes. The Type 7C's pressure hull, for all its engineering, was vulnerable to damage at depth in ways that accumulated rather than healed. A near miss from a depth charge could spring valves, crack welds along stressed seams, and disable ballast tank controls that were not always repairable at sea. The boat's battery capacity, generous for its time, still imposed a hard ceiling on how long it could remain submerged and how fast it could move while doing so. Once those batteries ran low, the boat had to surface to run the diesels and recharge, and surfacing in daylight, in the presence of aircraft or surface escorts, was among the most dangerous acts a commander could perform. The Type 7C asked a great deal of the men who crewed it, and in return it gave them exactly one thing beyond its weapons and machinery: the possibility of survival, if they were skilled enough and fortunate enough to deserve it. By 1942 and into 1943, the Type 7C was coming off the yards in substantial numbers, flowing into operational flotillas at a rate that reflected the extraordinary industrial priority the Kriegsmarine had placed on its submarine program. Dozens of hulls entered service across those years, each one assigned a crew, a commander, and a patrol grid that would take it into some of the most contested waters on Earth. The boats that emerged from those yards were as uniform in their construction as the production system could make them, yet each one developed its own character through the particular combination of commander, crew, and accumulated experience that no specification could capture. Some earned reputations for aggression, others became known for the quiet skill with which they slipped away from danger. Many simply disappeared into the Atlantic without explanation, their last radio reports growing older in the files at Lorient until the date of loss was entered in a different column of the record. It was into this world of steel and diesel and cold deep water, of tactical doctrine and institutional momentum, of enormous potential paired with enormous mortality, that Jochen Mohr would bring himself and the men who would serve under him. The Type 7C was not a forgiving machine. It offered no margin for carelessness and very little for bad luck. What it offered instead was capability, the means to cross an ocean, find a target, strike it, and survive the aftermath if the commander was good enough and the crew trusted him enough to follow his judgment into places where the physics of the ocean and the weaponry of the enemy conspired constantly against their return. Understanding the machine is not the same as understanding the man, but you cannot understand what Mohr became without first understanding what he climbed down into when he sealed the hatch above his head and gave the order to dive. The smell of fresh steel and cutting oil does not leave a man easily. For those who served in the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm, the commissioning of a new boat carried with it a particular kind of weight, not the grime of a vessel seasoned by ocean and war, but the clean, almost clinical scent of a machine that had never yet been asked to prove itself. When Jochen Mohr walked the length of U-220 for the first time as her commanding officer, he was standing inside something that existed, in that precise moment, as pure potential. The boat had come through the yards without a scratch, without a history, without ghosts. What happened next would be his to shape, and his alone to answer for. The year was 1943, and the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet was at a complicated crossroads. On paper, the numbers looked formidable. Hundreds of boats were operational across the Atlantic approaches, and the Wolf Pack doctrine had extracted an enormous toll from Allied merchant shipping in the preceding years. But the men who studied the intelligence reports carefully, the admirals, the operations planners, the veteran commanders returning from patrol, could read a different story beneath the surface figures. Allied countermeasures were improving with a speed that bordered on alarming. Radar sets were growing sharper. Convoy escorts were growing more numerous and more skilled. The ocean that had once offered a kind of anonymous freedom to a surfaced U-boat at night was becoming something else entirely, a killing ground that worked in both directions. It was into this shifting world that U-220 arrived. A newly commissioned Type 7C boat was, in the language of the yards, a finished product. Every weld had been inspected, every valve tested, every torpedo tube cycled through its mechanical range. But a submarine is not finished at the moment it leaves the slip. It is finished when its crew has become one organism with the steel around them, when the men know, without looking, which valve controls which system, which sound means safety, and which sound means danger. That process does not happen in a shipyard. It happens at sea, under pressure, through repetition, and occasionally through failure. Mohr understood this. His time under experienced commanders had taught him that a boat is only as ready as her slowest man, and that the commanding officer's first responsibility is to close that gap before the Atlantic forces the question on his behalf. Crew selection was not a simple matter of filling billets from available personnel pools. Mohr approached it with the same methodical attention he brought to navigation problems and tactical planning. He needed an engineering watch officer who could keep machinery functional under conditions no specification document had anticipated. He needed a first watch officer whose judgment he could trust implicitly when exhaustion or injury took the commanding officer off the bridge. He needed torpedo mechanics who could coax reliable performance from weapons that were, despite constant refinement, still prone to failures at the worst possible moments. And he needed men in the lower ratings who would hold together under depth charge attack, men who would not freeze, would not panic, and would not infect the others with their fear when the pressure hull groaned and the lights went out. Finding such men required assessment, conversation, and a certain instinct that no formal process could substitute. The shakedown period began in the calmer waters of the Baltic, where newly commissioned boats and newly assembled crews were traditionally tested before being committed to operational service. The Baltic in the early months of 1943 was cold and grey, the water shallow enough to add its own complications to diving exercises, the weather frequently unpleasant without being genuinely dangerous. For U-220's crew, those weeks were a compressed education. Diving drills were run until the sequence became automatic. Emergency procedures were practiced until the men could execute them in darkness, half-dressed, roused from sleep by an alarm that offered no explanation. Mohr drove the training hard, but without theatre. He was not a commander who used fear as a motivational tool. He was a commander who used competence, building it, measuring it, and making clear to every man aboard that their survival would depend entirely upon how seriously each of them took the work in front of them. One particular aspect of shakedown operations that drew Mohr's sustained attention was communication between the control room and the engine spaces. In the tight geography of a Type 7C boat, the physical distance between the commanding officer and his engineering crew was measured in meters rather than kilometers, and yet the potential for miscommunication in a crisis was enormous. The engine room watch had to interpret orders relayed through noise and vibration, and sometimes through the additional confusion of flooding or fire. Mohr established a rhythm of practice specifically aimed at this vulnerability, running scenarios that required precise, rapid coordination across the boat's length. The crews of veteran boats had developed this coordination over patrols. His crew would have to develop it over weeks, and then sustain it under conditions that no Baltic exercise could truly replicate. By the time U-220 was declared operationally ready and transferred to the Atlantic Theatre, Mohr had formed a clear assessment of what he had. He had a crew that was technically competent, cautiously confident, and still untested in the specific psychological crucible of being hunted by warships whose crews wanted nothing more than to send them to the bottom. That last quality, that untested quality, was the one that concerned him most, not because he doubted his men, but because he knew that no amount of preparation fully closes the distance between expectation and reality when the first depth charge detonates close enough to shatter glass and split seams. What he also had, however, was a boat that was mechanically sound, a set of officers in whom he had genuine confidence, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of everything he had learned in his previous service. These were not nothing. In the Atlantic of 1943, they were a foundation. The fleet headquarters that received U-220 into operational disposition was managing a submarine arm stretched across thousands of nautical miles of ocean, distributed across patrol zones that ranged from the waters around the British Isles to the approaches of West Africa. The strategic logic of the campaign had not changed in its fundamentals. Find the convoys, attack the convoys, impose a rate of loss upon Allied shipping that exceeded the Allies' capacity to replace what was sunk. But the execution of that logic was growing more complicated with every passing month. Boats were being lost at rates that the previous year's losses had not prepared the High Command to accept emotionally, even as they accepted the figures on paper. The arrival of a new, ready boat under a trained commander was therefore not a routine administrative event. It represented a genuine addition to an arm that was beginning, quietly and with considerable institutional resistance, to feel the weight of attrition. Mohr received his operational orders with the kind of careful attention he gave to everything that came to him in writing. The patrol zone assigned to U-220 required a transit across open ocean that would test the boat's endurance and the crew's stamina before a single weapon had been fired in anger. Fuel consumption, navigation across open water, watch rotations that maintained alertness without burning men out before they arrived. These were the practical realities that occupied a commanding officer's attention during transit, even as the broader tactical picture remained in the background of every decision. He studied the available intelligence on convoy routes, on known escort dispositions, on the areas where Allied air coverage was heaviest and where gaps might still be exploited. He did not make assumptions. He built instead a careful picture of the environment he was entering, and he shared enough of that picture with his officers that they could function as genuine partners in the decisions to come. What struck those who served under Mohr in this period, according to the accounts that later emerged, was a quality that was rarer than tactical skill in the submarine arm: patience. The culture of U-boat command had long celebrated aggression, the bold approach, the close shot, the willingness to press an attack despite risk. Mohr did not repudiate aggression, but he placed it in a framework that required judgment before action. He was not interested in heroic gestures that produced results at the cost of his boat or his crew. He was interested in sustained effectiveness, in the kind of combat performance that could be maintained over multiple patrols rather than exhausted in a single dramatic episode. Whether this quality came from temperament or from the careful observation of commanders who had burned brightly and briefly, it marked his approach to U-220's integration into active operations in a way that would define what followed. There is a kind of waiting that belongs specifically to submarines, a waiting that is not passive but intensely, almost unbearably active. U-220 entered the Atlantic as a boat prepared for that waiting. Her crew had been trained to its limits without being broken by them. Her mechanical systems had been verified to the standard that qualified engineers could achieve without the confirmation that only operational stress provides. Her commanding officer had assembled around himself a group of men whose collective competence he had measured and found sufficient. Whether sufficient would prove to be enough was a question the ocean would answer in its own time and on its own terms. The commissioning was complete, the shakedown was done, the first patrol awaited, and with it, the beginning of whatever history U-220 was going to make. The spring of 1943 carried with it a particular kind of cold, not the deep freeze of winter, but the persistent, bone-settling damp that rolls off the North Atlantic in long grey sheets, pressing against steel hulls and soaking through the clothing of men who stand watch on narrow conning towers. It was into this season, and into this ocean, that U-220 slipped for the first time as a vessel at war. Her shakedown exercises were behind her. The crew had drilled until the motions of diving, surfacing, loading, and retreating were no longer thought but reflex. Jochen Mohr had ensured that. He had spent weeks demanding repetition, not because he doubted his men, but because he understood the ocean well enough to know that doubt arrives at the worst possible moment, and reflex is the only thing that answers it in time. Now, under a sky the colour of old iron, the boat nosed westward into open water, and her first real patrol had begun. Those who knew the culture of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm in that period would have recognized something slightly different in Mohr's approach from the first day out of port. The spirit animating many of his contemporaries was one of aggressive forward momentum, of tonnage as currency and speed as virtue. Commanders were celebrated in the press. Decorations were awarded at fleet ceremonies with theatrical gravity. The system rewarded those who sank the most ships in the shortest time, and it produced men who pressed hard into convoys under circumstances that cooler judgment might have declined. Mohr was not immune to the pressures of that culture, but he appeared to metabolize them differently. He had studied enough of what had gone wrong for other boats to understand that the commanders who came home were not always the most celebrated ones, and that the Atlantic did not distribute its judgments according to rank. The early days of the patrol were spent on observation more than action. Mohr held his crew to strict routines that imposed discipline on the passage of time. Watch rotations were kept tight. Hydrophone operators were drilled in the subtle art of distinguishing ship noise from ocean noise, a skill that in 1943 had become something closer to survival craft than technical exercise. Mohr was known to sit beside the hydrophone station himself during quiet hours, listening, not because he distrusted his operators, but because he believed a commander who understood every instrument aboard his boat was a commander who made better decisions when those instruments delivered bad news. The crew noted this. It was not the behavior of a man performing authority. It was the behavior of someone who took the weight of those around him seriously. Contact with Allied shipping came gradually, as it often did on the Atlantic run. There was no single thunderclap of discovery, no sudden bloom of targets on the horizon. Instead, there were traces, a distant smudge of smoke, a faint vibration through the hull that the hydrophone operators translated into rotating screws, the occasional radio intercept that suggested organized traffic in the area. Mohr did not rush toward any of it. He positioned the boat with patience, spending hours at periscope depth when the temptation to surface and close distance quickly must have pressed against his caution with real force. The newer commanders tended to chase. Mohr tended to wait and let the geometry of the ocean bring the target toward him rather than the other way around. His first genuine firing opportunity on this patrol came against a merchant vessel traveling at the edges of an organized convoy, slightly separated from its companions in the way that slower ships sometimes fell behind. The conditions were workable but not ideal: a modest swell, moderate visibility, and an escort presence that demanded careful track-keeping before any approach could be safely committed. Mohr spent time in observation before committing to the attack solution. He worked the problem methodically, confirming course, estimating speed, cross-checking his navigator's calculations before authorizing the firing sequence. When the torpedo left the tube and the seconds of silence stretched out in the control room, the tension in the boat was absolute. The detonation, when it came, was felt before it was heard. A low thump transmitted through the water and into the hull, followed by the sound his crew had drilled to recognize as a hit. The merchant went down. Mohr did not linger to watch. He had already ordered a course change and was driving the boat deep before the escort vessels could organize their response. This was the point at which his temperament diverged most visibly from some of his contemporaries. There were commanders who would have remained in the area, drawn back by the possibility of a second target in the same waters while the escorts were still reacting. Mohr understood the logic of that calculation but rejected its arithmetic. One confirmed kill and a boat still intact was a better outcome than a second attack under deteriorating conditions that ended with depth charges and a crew who never came home. He had studied the loss records carefully enough to know that many boats were lost not on first contact, but on the decision to stay for more. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that would have seemed unremarkable by the standards of more decorated patrols. There were contacts that developed into attacks, and contacts that dissolved into nothing when the geometry refused to cooperate. There were stretches of empty ocean where the only evidence of war was the routine itself, the diving and surfacing, the battery charging runs in darkness, the careful management of food and fresh water as the patrol lengthened. Mohr presided over this rhythm with something approaching studied equanimity. He maintained his composure through the dry spells with the same steadiness he brought to moments of action, and this consistency communicated itself to the men around him in ways that no speech could have manufactured. The crew's relationship with their commander during this patrol was one of cautious assessment, as it often was during a first real operation under a new captain. They were watching him in the way all crews watch a captain they do not yet fully know, measuring the distance between what a man promises in training and what he actually does when the conditions are unfriendly. What they observed was a man who did not panic, who did not inflate the significance of minor successes, and who did not punish honest mistakes with the kind of theatrical anger that some commanders deployed as a management tool. One petty officer later recalled, in the language that veterans use when they are being careful with memory, that Mohr treated his crew as though they were capable of understanding why they were doing what they were doing, rather than simply demanding that they do it. There were moments of genuine danger during those weeks that tested both the commander and the boat. Aerial patrols had intensified across the Bay of Biscay and the western approaches, and the Allied aircraft that hunted U-boats in 1943 were increasingly capable machines carrying increasingly capable weapons. On at least one occasion during the patrol, U-220 was forced into an emergency dive when an aircraft was sighted at close range, and the boat spent an uncomfortable stretch of hours at depth, while Mohr calculated the risk of resurfacing. The decision to wait, rather than attempt to ascend into potentially hostile conditions, was the right call. The crew understood this, even in the silence and heat of the submerged boat, even as the hours stretched and the air grew stale. By the time U-220 began her return passage, the balance sheet of the patrol was modest by the standards that fleet headquarters preferred to publish. The tonnage figures were real, but not spectacular. The number of confirmed sinkings was sufficient to establish that Mohr had located and engaged the enemy, but insufficient to generate the kind of acclaim that elevated certain commanders to public prominence. In the Kriegsmarine's internal culture of those years, modest results carried a faint stigma. There were officers at fleet headquarters who tallied scores the way spectators track athletic performance, and a patrol that returned with its crew intact but its trophy count low occupied an ambiguous position in that accounting. Mohr appeared to regard this ambiguity with something close to indifference. The boat had completed its first combat patrol. The crew had performed well under operational conditions. No man had been lost. The vessel had absorbed the stresses of an Atlantic patrol and returned to port with her essential systems functioning. By the measure he applied to himself, this was a successful outcome. He submitted his patrol report in the factual, precise language that characterized his documentation, noting what had been achieved and what conditions had prevented, without the rhetorical inflation that some commanders introduced into their official accounts in order to manage upward impressions of their performance. The report was what it was. The patrol had been what it was. What the first patrol of U-220 established, in the quiet and unglamorous way that genuine professional formation works, was the shape of Jochen Mohr as a wartime commander. He was not the kind of officer the propaganda machine celebrated. He was not the kind of man who calculated his actions with one eye on the ceremony where decorations were distributed. He was something less dramatic and considerably more useful to the people who sailed beneath him, a captain who brought the boat home, who spent his crew's safety with the careful reluctance of someone who understood precisely what he was spending, and who regarded the ocean not as an arena for personal distinction, but as a profoundly serious environment that punished complacency faster than it rewarded courage. That understanding had been theoretical during training. The first patrol had made it real, and in doing so, had set the foundation for everything that was to follow in the waters ahead. The Atlantic in 1943 had become a fundamentally different ocean than it had been just 2 years before. The early days of the submarine war, when German captains operated almost with impunity against poorly defended merchant traffic, belonged to history. By the time Jochen Mohr brought U-220 to operational status, the Allies had transformed their defensive posture with revolutionary speed and determination. Convoy organization had improved dramatically, with escort vessels now equipped with increasingly sophisticated sonar and radar systems that could detect submarines at ranges that seemed to defy belief. Aircraft, once a nuisance to be avoided, had become a lethal presence that could appear without warning on the horizon, forcing a U-boat to crash dive within seconds of spotting their wings. The hunters who had dominated the first years of the Atlantic War now found themselves constantly hunted, and survival had become as important as success. Mohr understood this transition with crystal clarity as he took U-220 deeper into the operational zones where merchant convoys moved across the Atlantic. His first patrols had given him glimpses of the new reality, but each voyage reinforced the lesson with increasing emphasis. The old tactics of the German U-boat ace, the aggressive wolf pack assault on a weakly protected convoy, had become a formula for destruction rather than victory. The British and Americans had learned to concentrate their escort forces, to deploy them with ruthless efficiency, and to pursue damaged or attacking submarines with a determination that bordered on the fanatic. Mohr's caution, which might have seemed like timidity to more aggressive commanders, revealed itself as the wisdom of a man who had grasped the true nature of modern submarine warfare. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground where a skilled predator could operate with confidence and expect to withdraw safely. It had become an arena of mutual threat, where the submarine captain who survived would be the one who understood not just how to attack, but how to vanish. The encounter between a submerged U-boat and an active convoy escort represented a collision between incompatible visions of survival. The escort commander above the water sought to protect the merchantmen under his charge and to destroy any threat he detected. The submarine captain beneath the surface sought to inflict maximum damage while minimizing the risk of detection and retribution. These conflicting imperatives created a form of three-dimensional chess, played in an environment where both sides operated at the limits of their sensory perception and technical capability. Mohr's skill lay not merely in finding convoys, which the German Navy's intelligence and weather analysis could often accomplish, but in approaching them undetected and choosing his moment of attack with such precision that he could strike before the escorts could respond with overwhelming force. This required intimate knowledge of how sonar and radar functioned, what their limitations were, and how sound traveled through water under different temperature and salinity conditions. It demanded an almost intuitive understanding of escort doctrine and the psychology of escort commanders who might make predictable decisions under pressure. The technical details of evasion defined the narrow margin between success and catastrophe. A Type 7C submarine like U-220 could maintain a submerged speed of approximately 7 knots, which meant that outrunning a determined surface escort was virtually impossible. The submarine's advantage lay entirely in stealth and the ability to remain undetected while gathering information about the convoy's position and movement. Mohr learned to use the thermocline, the layer of water where temperature dropped sharply and created an acoustic barrier that could degrade sonar performance. He would position U-220 just below the thermocline, moving at the slowest possible speed to minimize the acoustic signature his vessel generated. Every meter his U-boat moved through the water represented an increase in risk. Every turn of the propellers, a chance that the escort's sonar operator would detect the characteristic sound of a submarine in motion. The British and Americans had crews trained to recognize these sounds, To distinguish the profile of a German U-boat from the ambient noise of the ocean, and Mohr had to operate with the knowledge that a single auditory mistake could bring a salvo of depth charges down upon his vessel. The confrontation with Allied aircraft introduced an entirely different dimension to the art of evasion. A U-boat on the surface could achieve the speeds necessary to patrol effectively and cover the vast distances required to find convoys. But the surface was where aircraft hunted most effectively, and a Sunderland flying boat or a Liberator bomber could appear on the horizon with terrifying speed. Mohr developed a rigid discipline regarding aircraft watch, with lookouts trained to scan every quadrant of the sky with unrelenting vigilance. The interval between spotting an aircraft and the submarine's disappearance beneath the surface represented the most critical moment of danger, a window of vulnerability measured in seconds. The U-boat that failed to detect an approaching aircraft in time, or that hesitated in its dive, could be bombed or strafed before the hatch sealed. Mohr had heard the stories from other captains, vessels damaged by aerial attack and forced to limp back to base, or lost entirely with all hands. He understood that caution regarding air threats was not excessive nervousness, but rather a rational acknowledgement of the reality that technological superiority belonged to the surface world. The psychological dimension of evasion operated at a level that consumed the mental resources of every man aboard U-220 during extended patrols. Submariners lived in a state of controlled anxiety, where the possibility of detection and attack remained constant and ever-present. The crew knew that their only protection was the hull around them, a structure of welded steel that could withstand enormous external pressure when intact, but which a single torpedo or close-depth charge attack could rupture catastrophically. Mohr maintained discipline through routine, through the careful maintenance of the watch schedule, and through ensuring that every man understood his role in the survival of the vessel and crew. The air grew thick and foul after days submerged, the carbon dioxide scrubbers working at maximum capacity to remove the waste products of respiration. Men experienced fatigue that went beyond simple tiredness, a mental exhaustion compounded by the inability to leave the confines of the U-boat, and by the knowledge that at any moment the descent into chaos and drowning could begin. The captain who could manage this psychological pressure, who could maintain focus and clarity despite the oppressive environment and constant threat, possessed a form of professional mastery that transcended mere tactical competence. Mohr's approach to evasion emphasized positioning and patience rather than aggressive response to threat. When an escort vessel's sonar painted the hull of U-220 with acoustic pulses, the standard response of a pursued submarine was to alter course, increase speed, and attempt to create distance between itself and the threat. This approach invited the sort of aggressive pursuit that often led to sustained depth charge attacks lasting hours. Mohr instead advocated for radical course changes at very slow speeds, positioning U-220 behind the pursuit vector of the escort vessel, effectively placing the U-boat in the acoustic dead space created by the escort's own sonar blind zone. This required an intuitive grasp of three-dimensional space and an almost preternatural calm in the face of approaching destruction. His crew reported that during these moments Mohr would speak in measured tones, issuing orders that transformed panic into focused action. The men who served under him learned to trust his instincts, to believe that their captain possessed some form of wisdom that would guide them through the danger and bring them safely through to the other side. The damage that U-220 sustained during one particularly harrowing encounter illustrated both the effectiveness of Mohr's evasion techniques and the genuine proximity of destruction that characterized his patrols. An escort ship had achieved a sonar contact and had initiated a determined attack run, closing the distance to deliver a pattern of depth charges across the U-boat's estimated position. Mohr had already begun an evasive maneuver, angling U-220 into a sharp descent while simultaneously altering the submarine's course to port and reducing speed to near minimal levels. The first pattern of charges detonated approximately 150 meters distant, sending shock waves through the water that rendered every man aboard temporarily deaf and disoriented. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied as power was maintained from the emergency systems. A second pattern followed, closer this time, separated by seconds that felt like hours, each charge a hammer blow against the U-boat's hull that transmitted directly to the body and consciousness of every crew member. Water began to seep through a joint in the forward torpedo room, a fine mist that required immediate attention and would necessitate careful repair and concealment. The decision facing Mohr in these moments represented the ultimate expression of the submarine captain's responsibility. He could attempt to create distance and attempt to dive deeper, pressing U-220 toward the crush depth where water pressure would destroy the hull. He could surface and engage the escort with the U-boat's deck gun, a futile but defiant gesture that might at least inflict some damage before the escort's superior firepower destroyed the submarine. Or he could maintain his current course and depth, hoping that his evasive maneuver had been sufficiently effective to place U-220 outside the escort's attack pattern. Mohr chose the third option, maintaining absolute silence in the U-boat while monitoring the escort's sonar activity through the hydrophone operators. The muffled sounds of the escort's engines grew quieter as minutes passed, suggesting that the pursuit was beginning to falter. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 minutes, the characteristic pinging of active sonar ceased, and the escorts moved away to resume their protective patrols around the convoy. The aftermath of such an encounter required physical repairs, but also psychological recovery. The crew of U-220 emerged from these experiences exhausted, shaken, but alive, because their captain had possessed the technical knowledge and psychological composure to navigate an impossible situation. Mohr understood that his reputation among his men rested entirely on his ability to keep them alive while conducting successful operations. A captain who drove his crew into danger and lost the U-boat earned nothing but contempt in the submarine service. Conversely, a captain who maintained excessive caution and never achieved significant results would see his crew's morale erode through lack of purpose and achievement. Mohr navigated this narrow passage with a balance that kept U-220 effective while never pushing the submarine toward unnecessary destruction. His decision-making reflected a maturity and judgment that went far beyond simple tactical competence or aggressive ambition. The technological race between U-boat evasion techniques and Allied detection methods created a constantly shifting battlefield where yesterday's successful tactic could become tomorrow's death trap. Mohr stayed informed about improvements in British and American sonar, about new patterns in convoy escort deployment, and about the evolving threats posed by additional aircraft types entering service. He shared information with other U-boat captains during the brief periods when U-220 returned to base for refueling and resupply. These conversations provided crucial intelligence about what techniques were working, what had failed catastrophically, and what tactical adjustments might improve survival rates. The German U-boat arm possessed a sophisticated system for disseminating this information through the submarine headquarters, and Mohr read every report and tactical summary that came his way. He understood that survival in the Atlantic War depended not just on his individual skills, but on his willingness to learn from the collective experience of all U-boat captains facing the same threats. By the time U-220 had completed several patrols under Mohr's command, the reputation of the captain had spread through the submarine service. He was not known as the most aggressive or the most successful in terms of raw tonnage sunk, but rather as a captain who consistently brought his U-boat and crew home safely while achieving respectable results. This reputation, while perhaps not as glamorous as that of U-boat aces with massive kill totals, represented a form of respect among professional submarine officers. Mohr had demonstrated that in the modern Atlantic War, the captain who survived was more valuable to the German Navy than the captain who achieved spectacular results and subsequently lost his vessel and crew. His methodical approach to evasion, his refusal to panic under pressure, and his commitment to keeping U-220 operational represented not a lack of aggression, but rather a sophisticated understanding of the true mathematics of submarine warfare. In an environment where the technological advantage belonged increasingly to the Allies, where detection systems were improving faster than German countermeasures could compensate, a captain like Mohr, who had mastered the art of becoming invisible, possessed a form of tactical mastery that would define the remainder of the Atlantic campaign. In the spring of 1943, Jochen Mohr stood at a threshold. His first patrol had been a cautious affair, a careful introduction to the realities of submarine command. The crew of U-220 had performed adequately, learning the rhythms of underwater combat without achieving distinction. But cautious competence alone would not advance a captain's career in the Kriegsmarine, where success was measured in tonnage sunk and the aggressive commanders earned the Iron Crosses and the promotions. Mohr understood this unspoken calculus. He was technically proficient and respected by his men, but respect and proficiency did not fill the war diary with victories. As U-220 departed on her second war patrol, heading south and westward toward the African coast and the warming waters of the Atlantic's less defended regions, Mohr carried with him a quiet determination to prove himself more than merely competent. The convoy lanes off West Africa were known to be less heavily escorted than the transatlantic routes closer to Britain. Here, ships moved slower, defenses were thinner, and a patient hunter might find abundance. The voyage south consumed weeks. U-220 crept through the vast emptiness of the open Atlantic, conserving fuel and maintaining vigilance. Radio signals crackled in the control room, carrying orders and intelligence from Dönitz's headquarters in Berlin. The U-boat arm maintained a network of radio direction finding and reconnaissance that attempted to guide submarines toward concentrations of shipping. It was an imperfect system, dependent on human intelligence, captured documents, and the deductions of experienced officers who understood merchant traffic patterns as a chess master understands position. The African coast drew supplies from all points of the globe: rubber from the Belgian Congo, cocoa and palm oil, chrome and manganese ore, tin and copper flowed northward in slow convoys guarded by overburdened escorts. These were the arteries of empire, the blood supply that kept Britain alive and fighting. Cutting these routes was Germany's strategy in the Atlantic, a form of strangulation conducted by undersea warfare. Mohr was now an instrument of that strategy, whether he fully embraced the ideology behind it or merely executed orders as a professional naval officer. The morning of the 24th of March brought the first sign. A lookout spotted smoke on the horizon, the dark smudge that betrayed the position of a steaming convoy. U-220 was on the surface, charging her batteries and making the best speed possible toward the reported contact. Mohr's heart quickened, though his face remained composed. Around him, the crew sensed the shift in atmosphere. This was no drill, no practice exercise. Somewhere beyond the curve of the sea lay ships laden with cargo, and they were undefended enough to be worth the risk of exposure. Mohr studied the smoke column carefully, noting its density and movement. He ordered the boat submerged and approached on an intercept course, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid creating a wake that might betray his presence to escort vessels. The mathematics of submarine attack demanded patience. A boat that rushed would alert her prey, force the convoy to scatter and evade, and likely receive fire from desperate defenders. Better to slide into position, to rest in the convoy's path, like a crocodile waiting at a watering hole. The convoy materialized gradually as U-220 crept closer beneath the surface. What emerged was convoy SL-125, a slow formation of approximately 20 cargo ships shepherded by 3 escort vessels that seemed simultaneously brave and desperately inadequate. The escorts were a British minesweeper, a trawler converted for anti-submarine duty, and a smaller sloop. Good men commanded those vessels, experienced officers who understood the danger and moved in pattern to protect their charges. But 3 ships against 20 heavy targets spread across a broad area, with a U-boat approaching from the darkest part of the tactical equation, created an impossible geometry for defense. Mohr positioned U-220 ahead of the convoy's track, in the darkness, and waited. The convoy would come to him. All the patience that had been drilled into him, all the tactical doctrine that emphasized survival and conservation alongside aggression, now informed his approach. This was not the reckless style of the famous commanders, the aces who drove through convoys at periscope depth, trading caution for spectacular success. Mohr played a different game, one designed to maximize effectiveness and minimize risk to his boat. The attack came in the early hours, when darkness still held absolute sway and the convoy's watch was at its dullest. Mohr fired his first 2 torpedoes at a large cargo ship, a vessel laden with supplies whose loss would harm the British effort. The detonations tore through the water seconds later, a double strike that sent the ship heeling over, her back broken by explosions that killed many men in an instant and doomed hundreds more to the Atlantic's embrace. The convoy erupted into confusion. Ships altered course desperately, some toward the stricken vessel in misguided rescue attempts, others scattering outward in individual panic. The escorts rushed toward the disturbance, their crews manning gun positions and preparing depth charges with the hope that they might locate and destroy the attacker before more damage was done. Mohr, observing through the periscope, watched the human drama unfold with the peculiar detachment that combat required. He had killed men he had never met, men who had families and hopes and lives that extended far beyond this moment. But they were enemies, or at least they were in the service of an enemy, and the Atlantic was a place where sympathy was a luxury that got submarines sunk. The second victim came within minutes. Another torpedo found its mark on a second vessel, and again the terrible bloom of explosion and fire told the story of metal torn and lives ended. The convoy was now thoroughly disrupted, circling and turning in an attempt to avoid the threat they could not see. The escorts threw depth charges with increasing desperation, explosions that shook U-220's hull and sent tremors through every system. But Mohr had already moved, already repositioned to launch another attack. He had carefully managed his approach speed and angle, had considered the likely responses of the escorts, and had positioned himself to remain dangerous while accepting acceptable levels of risk. A third ship fell to his torpedoes, and a fourth. Each attack was deliberate, each target selected to maximize damage to the convoy's overall capability. Mohr was not hunting for the visceral satisfaction of the kill or the personal glory of a high score. He was executing a tactical calculation that removed cargo from the global supply network and reduced Britain's ability to fight. But the escorts were pressing closer now, their positions clarified by their own transmissions and the patterns of their movements. Mohr could feel the noose tightening, could sense through the boat's hydrophones the presence of the hunters who now hunted him with intent born of rage and duty. A depth charge detonated very close to the starboard side, close enough to cause meters to spin and alarms to sound throughout the boat. The crew held their breathing, held their positions, held their nerve as their captain remained absorbed in the periscope eyepiece, watching the final moments of another merchant ship settling into the sea. 4 vessels down, their cargo scattered across the bottom, their crews dead or struggling in lifeboats or drowning in the cold Atlantic. The human cost was profound, but it was a cost that Mohr had learned to separate from the technical satisfactions of the operation. Professionalism demanded this compartmentalization, this ability to recognize that war was fundamentally a killing enterprise and that his role in it required him to kill effectively or be killed himself. U-220 fled the scene at maximum submerged speed, running silent and deep beneath the thermocline that might hide her presence from listening ears. Behind her, the convoy was shattered, its formation broken, several ships burning or sinking or already resting on the bottom. The escorts raged across the sea, their sonar pinging uselessly into the depths, their depth charges expending themselves against the empty water where the submarine had already ceased to be. Mohr ordered the boat to creep slowly along a circuitous route, using the acoustic shadows of water temperature gradients and remaining silent for hours. He would not resurface until darkness returned, and distance had transformed his presence from immediate threat into historical fact. The surviving ships of the convoy would limp onward toward their destination without their lost cargo, without the crews of the sunken vessels, carrying the story of the attack that would be reported to headquarters and analyzed and discussed among the merchant marine and naval establishments of the Allies. For Mohr, the operation represented a watershed moment. His first significant success had been achieved not through brilliant aggression but through careful planning and ruthless execution. He had demonstrated that he could locate convoys, analyze tactical situations, select targets, and command a boat through a coordinated attack sequence while remaining alive and dangerous. Word of the victory rippled through the U-boat arm, noted by staff officers and appreciated by crews who understood that success in this war was the currency of advancement and resources. The tonnage figures were posted and tallied, another step toward whatever status the Kriegsmarine had begun to assign to its most successful commanders. But beneath the professional satisfaction and the recognition of competence well executed, Mohr carried something else as well, something unspoken, and perhaps not fully acknowledged even to himself. He had crossed a threshold from training to practice, from theoretical capability to actual killing. The weight of that transformation, the knowledge that his decisions had ended multiple lives in the space of minutes, settled into some compartment of his consciousness that he would not fully examine during wartime, but which would remain with him as long as he lived. The return to port allowed U-220 to refit, and her crew to rest and experience something approaching normalcy before the next patrol cycle began. Mohr submitted his reports, describing the attack on convoy SL-125 with the factual precision that the Kriegsmarine required. 4 ships sunk, tonnage estimated, tactical situation favoring the defender who maintained discipline and patience, escorts well handled by their British commanders. There was no glorification in the account, no rhetoric of victory or triumph. It was the language of naval warfare, technical and measured, yet the implications of the success were unmistakable. Jochen Mohr had proven himself capable of more than competent patrol work. He had demonstrated the capacity to locate shipping, penetrate convoy screens, coordinate attacks, and survive the consequences. He was becoming the thing that the U-boat arm needed, an effective captain who combined aggression with professionalism and ambition with prudence. The path that had begun with cautious first steps was now illuminated by the success of convoy SL-125, pointing toward further operations, more opportunities, and the possibility of advancement in a service that valued results above all other measures of merit. The question that remained unresolved was how long that path would remain available, and what the ultimate destination of that journey would prove to be, as the Atlantic War deepened and transformed around him. The spring of 1943 arrived on the Atlantic with a peculiar mixture of hope and catastrophe. For the German U-boat arm, this season marked the beginning of the end. Though few commanders recognized it at the time, the Allies were developing new detection methods, deploying escort vessels with greater coordination, and filling the sky with long-range aircraft that hunted submarines across waters previously considered safe. Yet within this deteriorating strategic landscape, individual captains still found moments of spectacular success. For Jochen Mohr, one such moment was arriving. After months of careful patrols and modest results, he was about to undertake an operation that would transform him from a cautious professional into a figure of genuine consequence within the Kriegsmarine's elite submarine community. U-220 departed from the French Atlantic port with a crew that had grown confident in their commander's steady hand and meticulous attention to detail. Mohr had refrained from the aggressive tactics employed by some of his peers, those younger captains who threw their boats at every contact and burned their fuel in pursuit of high-tonnage claims. His approach was different. Where others saw glory in speed and audacity, Mohr saw survival and sustained pressure. The crew understood this distinction. They appreciated a captain who calculated risks rather than courted death, who returned them safely to port more often than not, and whose judgment seemed rooted in genuine tactical insight rather than pride. This patrol would test both his caution and his boldness in equal measure, revealing the complexity of his command philosophy. The waters of the mid-Atlantic presented Mohr with an environment where the old rules still partially applied. Convoys moved through predetermined corridors, their routes often predictable to German naval intelligence despite increasing efforts at secrecy. Air cover remained inconsistent, with gaps that allowed submarines to operate during daylight hours if they moved carefully and remained alert. Mohr positioned U-220 in one such corridor, relying on his understanding of convoy patterns and the broader strategic picture transmitted by German headquarters. He maintained radio silence, avoiding the transmissions that might betray his position to Allied direction-finding equipment. His lookouts maintained constant watch, their eyes trained to detect the smoke plumes of distant merchant ships before any escort vessel could respond to their presence. The first contact came on a clear morning when visibility extended for many kilometers across the horizon. A masthead appeared first, then another, and another still. Within hours, Mohr had identified a substantial convoy, perhaps 20 or more merchant vessels, escorted by what appeared to be a moderate surface escort. The composition of this group told him much. British and Canadian destroyers and corvettes maintained station around the perimeter, their courses predictable, their communication patterns observable. Mohr took U-220 deep and began his attack approach, moving at the deliberate pace that consumed hours but preserved stealth. His crew moved through the submarine in practiced silence, each man aware that noise might be detected by the sensitive listening devices mounted on escort vessels. The tension aboard the boat accumulated slowly, building from calm professionalism into something more visceral. Mohr attacked with precision rather than aggression. He selected his targets carefully, choosing merchant vessels positioned on the convoy's periphery where his torpedo run would be neither obvious nor immediately answered by concentrated escort fire. The first vessel struck cleanly, an impact felt throughout U-220 as the detonation traveled through the water. Mohr did not linger to observe the sinking or celebrate the hit. Instead, he maneuvered for a second attack, understanding that the convoy's reaction time was already in motion. Escorts were turning toward the attack position, their depth charges being prepared for deployment. He had perhaps minutes before the window of opportunity closed. Another merchant ship fell to a well-placed torpedo, its hull rupturing below the waterline. Both vessels eventually sank, their crews forced into lifeboats or into the cold water itself. What distinguished this patrol from Mohr's previous operations was his ability to locate and intercept multiple convoys in succession rather than settling for a single engagement. After evading the response to his first attack, through careful maneuvering and depth control, Mohr repositioned U-220 for a continuation of the patrol rather than a withdrawal. The next days brought another convoy, then circumstances allowing for additional targeting. Across the span of this single patrol, Mohr's boat sank merchant vessels totaling tens of thousands of tons, a level of success that placed him among the more effective U-boat commanders active in 1943. Yet the number of kills represented only part of the achievement. What headquarters valued equally was the fact that U-220 had survived, had returned to port, and had demonstrated tactical proficiency under increasingly difficult conditions. The crew's reaction to their commander's success was complex and human in ways that statistics failed to capture. Pride existed in abundance. These men had participated in actions of genuine strategic consequence, sinking vessels that carried supplies and weapons intended for Allied nations fighting against Germany. The letters they might write to families contained references to their participation in this war, their contribution to the submarine effort. Simultaneously, however, something darker coexisted with this pride. The men aboard U-220 knew, perhaps with only partial clarity, that they had killed. The merchant ships they sank carried sailors like themselves, men with families and futures, now interrupted by explosions in the darkness. Some of these men had survived the sinkings and would later recount their experiences. Others did not survive, disappearing into the Atlantic with their ships. Mohr's crew did not dwell on these realities during operational patrols, but the knowledge existed somewhere in their consciousness, acknowledged and set aside in the service of duty. Mohr's evolution as a commanding officer reached a significant threshold during this breakthrough patrol. He had moved beyond the category of competent novice and entered the realm of dangerous expertise. The difference was not merely a matter of accumulated tonnage sunk or targets destroyed. Rather, it involved a demonstrated capacity for sustained judgment under pressure, for reading tactical situations with accuracy, for understanding the balance between aggression and self-preservation. His peers recognized this shift. Upon U-220's return to port, the reception from fleet headquarters was markedly different from that following earlier patrols. Senior officers who previously observed Mohr with cautious interest now recognized genuine talent. Commendations followed, along with suggestions that this was a captain whose methods and success ought to inform broader U-boat doctrine. The recognition brought responsibilities that extended beyond command of his own vessel. Other submarine captains, particularly those newly advanced to command, began observing Mohr's tactical approaches with interest. Some attempted to replicate his methods, though the combination of skill, intuition, and favorable circumstance that had produced his success could not be transferred through simple imitation. The Kriegsmarine's bureaucracy, always hungry for achievable results and reassuring narratives about the submarine war, seized upon Mohr's record as evidence that the Atlantic campaign remained winnable despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This tendency towards self-deception would characterize German military leadership increasingly as the war progressed. But in the spring of 1943, such delusions still contained a grain of plausibility. The strategic context surrounding Mohr's breakthrough patrol deserves emphasis because it reveals the peculiar nature of German success during this phase of the war. While Mohr was sinking merchant vessels in the mid-Atlantic, the broader U-boat campaign was beginning its irreversible decline. German naval intelligence was losing the intelligence war, their code systems compromised by Allied cryptographers at Bletchley Park. Convoys were becoming increasingly difficult to locate as coordinated escort tactics improved. Aircraft equipped with superior radar and increased endurance were extending their hunting ranges across waters previously considered safe for submarines. Most significantly, the sheer production capacity of American shipyards was replacing vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, a material reality that no individual captain's success could overcome. Yet from the perspective of Mohr and his crew, these larger strategic facts remained abstractions. What mattered was the immediate patrol, the current engagement, the next convoy to locate. The human dimension of Mohr's breakthrough cannot be separated from the technological and tactical dimensions without creating a distorted picture of his effectiveness. He possessed an intuitive understanding of his submarine's capabilities and limitations that extended beyond mere technical knowledge. He understood how U-220 responded to different types of attacks, how quickly she could maneuver, at what depths her hull integrity remained reliable. He knew his crew with the detail that allowed him to assign tasks according to individual competence and psychological resilience. When the noise and chaos of a depth charge attack created genuine danger, he possessed the calm required to make decisions that kept his men alive. This combination of technical mastery, tactical awareness, and leadership qualities was rare, which explains why Mohr's success during this patrol attracted attention from those responsible for prosecuting the U-boat war. As Mohr's patrol concluded and U-220 approached her home port, the crew understood that they had participated in something significant, though none could predict what implications this success might carry. They had not won the Atlantic War, nor could they have. They had not halted the Allied supply efforts or prevented the eventual defeat of Germany. What they had accomplished was a demonstration of individual skill and coordinated competence in one discrete moment of a vast conflict. For Jochen Mohr, this patrol represented a transition from competent commander to a figure whose name carried weight within the U-boat service. It was a threshold, a moment of genuine consequence, but also a moment whose ultimate meaning remained obscured by the chaos of ongoing warfare. The breakthrough had arrived, but the horizon beyond it remained dark and uncertain. By the autumn of 1943, the Atlantic had become a different ocean for German submariners. The early months of that year, when individual U-boat commanders could still find isolated merchant vessels and score multiple kills in a single patrol, had given way to a more contested environment. The British had steadily improved their escort practices, deploying faster destroyers and corvettes, while the Americans were learning the hard lessons of convoy warfare at an accelerating pace. Jochen Mohr, commanding U-220 with growing confidence and a modest record of confirmed sinkings behind him, now found himself drawn westward toward the richest hunting grounds of all, the shipping lanes that fed the American East Coast and the ports of New York and Boston. These waters had been the hunting domain of older U-boat commanders, men who had tasted early success during the first year of the American campaign. Now, as 1943 progressed into its final quarter, the nature of that hunt was transforming. The merchant traffic was heavier than ever before, but so too were the defenses. Mohr would need to be faster in his calculations, more precise in his tactics, and considerably more fortunate to survive what waited in those contested waters. The American convoy system in 1943 was not yet the formidable machine it would become by mid-1944, but it was far more dangerous than the ineffectual escort arrangements that had characterized the first year of American participation in the war. Ships were now traveling in organized formations, with assigned positions and communication protocols. The escort vessels, while still sometimes inadequate in number and capability, were equipped with improving detection equipment. Most critically, the American sailors and British officers coordinating these convoys were learning their profession. They studied U-boat tactics, they practiced coordinated maneuvers, and they shared information with sister ships about what worked and what failed. For a submarine commander approaching from the west, breaking through this increasingly competent defense required more than aggression. It required intelligence, patience, and the ability to exploit momentary lapses in the enemy's vigilance. Mohr's temperament, which had served him well in his earlier patrols, was well suited to this new reality. Where some commanders grew frustrated by the need to wait, to circle, to observe before attacking, Mohr seemed almost to prefer this methodical approach. He would position U-220 on the convoy's projected course, submerge, and wait. Hours would pass. Then, when the opportunity presented itself, he would act with controlled ferocity. The approach to American waters in 1943 also meant entering an environment where Allied air cover was becoming a persistent threat. The escort groups now included not only surface vessels, but also long-range maritime patrol aircraft operating from bases in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the northeastern United States. A U-boat attempting to maintain contact with a convoy had to remain close to the surface during daylight hours to keep visual observation. This meant constant exposure to the possibility of aerial attack. A single aircraft could force a submarine to dive, breaking contact with a target convoy and wasting days of careful stalking. Two or more aircraft, coordinating their attacks, could inflict serious damage or even sink a boat. Mohr quickly learned that the American bombing tactics were less refined than those the British had developed, but they were improving with experience. More importantly, the Americans had numbers. They could afford to send multiple aircraft on patrol routes, spreading a net across vast stretches of ocean. For Mohr, this meant that every patrol toward American waters demanded a recalibration of risk. The potential for profit remained high, but so did the potential for catastrophic loss. This was a calculation that the older, more aggressive U-boat commanders sometimes seemed unwilling to make. As Mohr brought U-220 into the operational zones between 40 and 50 degrees west longitude, he was operating at the very edge of effective German U-boat range. The return journey from these waters to the French bases that now served as the primary German submarine ports would consume nearly as many days as the profitable patrol itself. Fuel consumption was a constant concern, a mathematical problem that had to be solved before every decision to engage a target. Attacking a convoy meant using fuel to maneuver into position, to maintain contact, to evade counterattack. Every torpedo fired represented not only a weapon consumed but a psychological commitment to a course of action that might require rapid withdrawal if enemy forces responded more effectively than anticipated. The logistics of submarine warfare, which existed largely invisible to those who read accounts of U-boat heroics, consumed Mohr's attention alongside every tactical consideration. He had to know his boat's fuel state with precision. He had to understand how much diesel remained in each tank, how the weight distribution would affect trim and diving characteristics, and how to manage consumption during the long, slow transit back to base. This intellectual discipline, this constant mental accounting, separated the successful commanders from those whose ambition outpaced their judgment. The shipping traffic Mohr pursued in these western waters was increasingly vital to the Allied war effort. American factories were producing an almost incomprehensible volume of war materiel, and a significant portion of that production flowed eastward across the Atlantic to supply British forces and Soviet allies through the British Isles. The merchant convoys that carried this cargo were not empty of defensive value themselves. American-built Liberty ships, though not fast, were increasingly numerous, and each vessel sunk represented not merely a lost cargo, but a lost production slot in American shipyards. The United States was building ships faster than Germany could sink them, but this fact was not yet obvious to German command, and it surely would not have deterred Mohr had he known. His mission was to sink merchant vessels. Whether that mission remained strategically sound was not his concern. His crew, watching him from their stations throughout U-220, knew only that their commander was taking them to where the targets were, where opportunities for success existed, and where a successful patrol meant shore leave, recognition, and the possibility of advancement or transfer away from the submarine service. The patrols of the later months of 1943 showed Mohr developing patterns of operation that reflected his learning curve. Rather than attempting to engage convoys in the chaotic environment of multiple escorts and coordinated defenses, he began to position himself along the convoy routes and allow the formation to come to him. Once he had located a convoy, he would transmit a sighting report that brought other U-boats toward the target. The coordinated assault of multiple submarines against a single convoy, the so-called wolf-pack tactic, provided mutual protection and a higher probability of successful attacks. Individual commanders might score fewer kills in such operations, but the survival rates were marginally better. For Mohr, who seemed less driven by individual prestige than many of his peers, this cooperative approach seemed natural. He would share intelligence, coordinate attack timing with other captains through radio signals, and accept a reduced tally on his personal patrol report in exchange for a higher likelihood of returning to base. This approach, rational as it was, sometimes frustrated the more aggressive submarine commanders, who saw U-boat warfare as a competition for individual glory. The shifting balance of power in the Atlantic became increasingly apparent as 1943 advanced into its final months. Mohr experienced this transformation not as abstract strategic analysis, but as the concrete reality of narrowing windows of opportunity. A convoy that might have remained on the surface for hours, while a U-boat maneuvered into attack position, would now detect a submarine probe and respond with coordinated evasion and attack. The destroyers and corvettes escorting these convoys were growing more efficient in their search patterns, and they were beginning to employ new detection technologies that made evasion considerably more difficult. Mohr's crew, listening through the hydrophones mounted on U-220's hull, could sometimes detect the characteristic sound signatures of specific escort vessels. The steady thump of a British minesweeper's propeller, the different acoustic pattern of an American destroyer, These sounds became familiar in a way that transformed naval warfare into something almost intimate. A U-boat commander and an escort captain might hunt each other across weeks, each learning the other's tactics, each attempting to achieve surprise. Mohr was good at this dangerous game, but he was acutely aware that he was operating in waters where the odds were gradually shifting against him. The human element of these patrols, the constant state of readiness maintained by the men aboard U-220, produced a psychological strain that accumulated across weeks at sea. The submarine was designed for relatively short patrols, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks in duration, allowing the crew to recover physically and psychologically before returning to the ocean. But the distance to the American seaboard had stretched patrol durations to 4, sometimes 5 weeks. Men lived in conditions of extreme confinement, breathing air that grew progressively foul with carbon dioxide and the accumulated odors of machinery, fuel, human waste, and dozens of bodies in close quarters. The constant threat of detection, the necessity of remaining silent and motionless during daylight hours, the irregular sleep patterns required to maintain the watch rotation, all accumulated into a subtle but persistent exhaustion. Mohr's crew served well despite these conditions, a testament both to his selection of capable men and to his management of the psychological pressures inherent in submarine service. He allowed short periods of relaxation when safety permitted, he maintained discipline without cruelty, and he provided his men with the sense that their efforts served a purpose. Whether that purpose remained strategically sound was increasingly questionable, but the sense of purpose itself was sufficient to maintain morale and combat effectiveness. By the final months of 1943, Mohr's reputation within the U-boat arm was solidifying. He was not yet a celebrated ace in the manner of the older commanders who had achieved fame and promotion in the earlier phases of the war, but he was recognized as a capable, reliable commander who could be trusted to locate and attack convoys with reasonable success while maintaining the discipline and professionalism necessary to bring his boat and crew home. This reputation, while less glamorous than the headlines earned by commanders of larger submarines or those operating in more favorable tactical circumstances, perhaps reflected something closer to the reality of the modern naval officer. Mohr was not a romantic figure, not a swashbuckling corsair of the deep. He was a technical professional, skilled in the details of submarine operation, patient in the pursuit of distant targets, and effective in his execution of orders. In a war that increasingly demanded such qualities, his steadiness became an asset, even if it did not capture the imagination of propagandists seeking narrative drama. The tactical landscape that Mohr navigated in 1943 bore witness to a broader transformation underway in the Atlantic conflict. The U-boat arm, which had nearly brought Britain to starvation through commerce raiding in 1942, was now struggling to maintain operations in the face of coordinated Allied defences. The combination of improved escort tactics, longer-range aircraft, developing radar technology, and the sheer increasing volume of Allied shipping meant that the strategic calculus of U-boat warfare was shifting toward unsustainability. Mohr could not have known the precise statistics, but he sensed the reality. Targets remained abundant, but the ability to exploit those targets safely was declining. Each patrol brought new evidence of improving enemy capability. The speed with which escort vessels responded to U-boat contacts was increasing. The coordination between surface and air forces was improving. The persistence with which enemies hunted a detected submarine was becoming more systematic and more effective. These trends, accumulating month by month, suggested a future in which the submarine campaign would become a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Yet the operational orders kept coming, and Mohr kept taking U-220 to sea. This apparent contradiction between rational strategic assessment and continued operational commitment characterized much of the German military experience in 1943. The command structure remained committed to the submarine campaign, even as evidence accumulated that it could not succeed. Individual commanders, doubting the wisdom of their orders but trained to execute them, continued the effort. Mohr belonged to this tradition of professional obedience, and his patrols in 1943, running further west toward American waters and their defended convoys, represented not strategic hope, but institutional momentum. The machines continued to run because they were built to run, because the men commanding them had been trained to fight, and because no official acknowledgement had been made that the campaign was lost. By the end of 1943, Mohr had accumulated a respectable record of confirmed kills, sufficient to ensure his reputation and his continued command. But he had also experienced enough contact with improving Allied defenses to harbour few illusions about the future. The waters off the American coast, once promising hunting grounds, were becoming a gauntlet that only the fortunate or the skillful could traverse repeatedly. Mohr possessed both qualities, but he understood that fortune, like fuel and torpedoes, was a finite resource. A submarine is not merely a machine, it is a steel coffin that floats between two worlds, and the men who inhabit it must trust each other absolutely, or they will all die together in darkness. Jochen Mohr understood this truth from the moment he took command of U-220. The crew that joined him numbered just over 50 men, each hand-picked or assigned according to the Kriegsmarine's rigorous selection process. These were not conscripts swept randomly into service. They were specialists, mechanics, signalers, torpedo technicians, electricians, and hydro operators, chosen for their technical competence and psychological fitness to endure months of confinement in spaces so cramped that a man could touch both walls by extending his arms. Mohr's task was not simply to lead them into battle. It was to bind them into something stronger than fear, something that would hold firm when the depth charges detonated around them and the hull groaned under crushing pressure. From his first day aboard the new boat, Mohr set the tone. He was not a screaming martinet in the tradition of some U-boat commanders. He was precise, measured, and fair. Those who knew him would recall that he moved through the boat with quiet authority, speaking calmly, even in moments of high tension, never raising his voice unnecessarily. The culture of U-220 reflected Mohr's personality in tangible ways. Unlike some submarines where the captain was an isolated figure who appeared only at critical moments, Mohr was visible throughout the boat. He knew the names of every man, their families, their hometowns, and their particular skills. He remembered that the diesel mechanic from Hamburg had a daughter born just before the boat's commissioning. He knew that the young torpedo loader from Munich suffered from claustrophobia but had insisted on serving because his brother was already in the Navy. These details mattered because they transformed anonymous faces into recognized human beings. When a man felt seen and valued by his commanding officer, he performed better under stress. This was not sentiment on Mohr's part. It was tactical calculation, grounded in cold reality. A crew that believed their captain understood them would fight harder to keep the boat alive. A crew that felt abandoned or contempted would make mistakes, and mistakes in a submarine meant death for everyone aboard. Mohr's leadership style created a particular rhythm aboard U-220. During patrol, there was discipline and silence when operations demanded it. But during the long hours of transit between operational areas, when the boat ran submerged and there was nothing to do but maintain systems and wait, Mohr permitted a degree of relaxation that other captains forbade. Men were allowed quiet conversation. A harmonica could be played in the crew's quarters. These small liberties kept morale from collapsing under the psychological weight of prolonged underwater existence. The physical conditions aboard U-220 were genuinely brutal. 53 men occupied roughly 130 meters of interior space, most of it barely taller than a man's height. The air grew foul quickly, thick with moisture, and the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, sewage, and human bodies pressed together for weeks at a time. Ventilation was limited when the boat was submerged, and carbon dioxide accumulated to levels that made thinking difficult. The galley could serve perhaps 8 men at a time on benches barely wide enough to prevent a man from falling sideways. No one had a bunk of their own. The crew shared bunks in rotating shifts. One man would sleep in a hammock for 6 hours, while another worked his station. Then they would switch. No one had a bunk that was permanently theirs. The toilet was a single open facility shared by all, with no privacy whatsoever. The showers worked only rarely, and only when water could be spared from the distillation systems. A man on extended patrol might go for 4 or 5 weeks without washing more than his hands and face. These were not hardships that bred camaraderie automatically. They were conditions that tested bonds to their breaking point. Yet they also created a peculiar intimacy. A man knows his crewmates in ways that surface sailors can never know each other. He knows their fears, their habits, the sounds they make when they sleep. He knows whether the man next to him is reliable in crisis or prone to panic. He knows what another man can endure and what will break him. Mohr recognized that maintaining psychological stability was as important as maintaining the boat's mechanical systems. He instituted regular meetings in which crew members could raise concerns or problems without fear of retribution. These sessions were informal, but taken seriously. If a man reported that the forward bilge pump was making a strange sound, the chief engineer would investigate immediately. If a sailor expressed anxiety about a particular crew member's reliability, Mohr would assess whether a reassignment was needed. He also made a point of explaining tactical decisions to the crew, at least in broad terms. Other commanders kept their men in ignorance, telling them nothing about the patrol's objectives or their position. Mohr believed that men who understood the larger context of their mission performed better and suffered less psychological stress from uncertainty. When the boat was preparing to attack a convoy, Mohr would brief the crew on the composition of the target, the expected defenses, and the escape route he planned. This meant that when the depth charges began to fall, men knew they were under attack for a reason, that their captain had not made a reckless error. They were executing a calculated strategy rather than suffering random catastrophe. The relationship between Mohr and his chief engineer represented the foundation of the boat's cohesion. The chief engineer, sometimes called the first watch officer, was typically a man of experience and authority, often someone who had served on multiple boats. On U-220, this role was filled by a professional who had become, over the course of several patrols, Mohr's trusted counselor and the true backbone of the vessel. When Mohr made decisions about tactics or navigation, he consulted with the chief engineer about whether the boat's mechanical state could support those decisions. A submarine in combat is only as capable as its most damaged system. If the electric motors were having intermittent problems, or if a torpedo tube was slow to cycle, or if the air purification system was struggling, these conditions limited what Mohr could attempt. The chief engineer was the expert in those realities. He could tell Mohr firmly and with complete confidence that he would be heard, whether the boat was ready for an aggressive engagement or whether conservatism was required. This kind of relationship, where the commander trusts the expert absolutely, creates institutional courage. Men will take risks if they believe the risks have been carefully calculated by people who know the situation completely. The torpedo crews aboard U-220 were among the most specialized and most pressured men on the boat. They were responsible for maintaining and loading 2 external and 4 internal torpedo tubes, 4,000-kilogram weapons that were as temperamental as they were destructive. A torpedo could misfire, run erratically, or worse, activate prematurely and destroy the boat launching it. The torpedo crew's chief was a man who had been working with these weapons for years. He knew them intimately, understood their moods, could diagnose problems by sound alone. His assistants were younger, many barely past their early 20s, but they had been trained to a precise standard and drilled repeatedly until loading and firing became automatic. When Mohr ordered combat stations, these men entered a state of extreme focus. Their hands moved through practiced sequences, checking firing pin configurations, confirming tube flood statuses, monitoring acoustic signatures from the sonar operators who were listening for ships on the surface. During an attack, the torpedo crew felt the boat turn, heard the captain's commands transmitted through the speaking tube, and executed their part of the coordinated sequence that would launch a weapon toward an enemy ship. The crew could feel the slight compression shock as a torpedo fired, could track the running sound through the boat's own acoustic systems. When a torpedo struck its target, they heard the detonation through the water, felt it reverberate through the hull. This created a terrible intimacy with the act of killing. These young men were not detached from the consequences of their work. They could hear the explosions they caused. They could listen to the depth charges hunting them in response. The role of fear in the submarine service cannot be overstated, and it cannot be hidden. Every man aboard understood, with absolute clarity, that if the boat suffered critical damage, they would die. There was no lifeboat, no life raft, no realistic prospect of rescue. A sinking U-boat meant entrapment in a steel coffin on the ocean floor. Most men would drown. Some would suffocate as the air supply dwindled. A few might escape through the torpedo tubes if the crew flooding systems worked properly, but even that was marginal. The prospect was so grim that crews rarely discussed it directly. Instead, they developed rituals and superstitions. Objects brought aboard for luck were maintained with reverence. Patterns of behavior established during successful patrols were repeated religiously. When a crew came through a dangerous engagement without casualties, the entire boat felt the relief collectively, and bonds strengthened through the shared passage through crisis. Mohr was aware of these psychological currents, and he did not mock them or attempt to eliminate them through discipline. He permitted them because he understood that superstition, however irrational, was a valid coping mechanism. If a sailor needed to touch a particular location on the boat before diving, Mohr let him do it. If a crew believed that singing a particular song during patrol brought luck, the captain did not forbid it. He understood that morale was as real as hydraulic pressure or battery charge. Compromise it, and the boat might survive mechanically but fail in spirit. The moments between patrols, when U-220 returned to her base, were marked by a strange collision of contradictions. The boat was crammed and filthy after weeks at sea. The men were exhausted, and their bodies ached from constant motion and the tension of sustained alertness. Yet they were also alive. They had survived another patrol. In some cases, they had succeeded brilliantly, sinking enemy shipping and returning with victory claims confirmed or likely. The entire crew would be brought ashore together, and there was a peculiar camaraderie in their reunion with the support personnel, the dock workers, the mechanics who would refit the boat. For a few days, the crew would have shore leave. Some went to Bremen or Kiel, where there were bars, women, and the possibility of temporary escape from the reality of their service. Others remained near the base, preferring the company of other U-boat men who understood the peculiar exhaustion of the patrol. The bonds formed during weeks underwater persisted during these intervals ashore. The crew would gather in small groups, discussing the patrol, analyzing what had gone well and what had gone poorly. For younger crew members, these debriefing sessions were crucial learning opportunities. For experienced men, they were opportunities to reinforce their understanding of tactics and procedures. But beyond the professional content, these gatherings reinforced the sense that they were a unit, distinct from all other men in the Kriegsmarine, marked by an experience that civilians and even surface sailors could not truly comprehend. The cost of this intimacy and camaraderie was the extreme vulnerability to loss. If the boat was damaged or sunk, the men lost were not anonymous victims. They were known, understood, mourned personally by everyone who survived. U-220 was fortunate. Under Mohr's command, the boat and her crew were never involved in a catastrophic engagement that resulted in mass casualties, but they came close. They experienced depth charge attacks that damaged the hull. They had system failures that created emergency situations. Crew members did die, though in small numbers. Men overcome by carbon dioxide poisoning during ventilation failures. An electrician electrocuted when he made a mistake in the battery compartment. A young signalman who succumbed to pneumonia contracted in the damp, cold environment of a submerged boat. Each loss was felt throughout the crew. Mohr observed the protocols of military mourning. The deceased was honored, his family was notified, and his position was filled. But the sadness aboard the boat was real and acknowledged. Mohr did not attempt to suppress it or accelerate the crew's return to normal functioning. He permitted grief while maintaining discipline. This delicate balance was perhaps the truest mark of his leadership. The crew of U-220 existed in a state of perpetual danger, bound together by shared risk, shared hardship, and shared knowledge of each other that was almost uniquely intimate. They were not friends in the conventional sense. They were something perhaps stronger, men who had proven their reliability to each other under the worst possible conditions. When the Atlantic campaign turned decisively against Germany in 1944, when U-boats began dying by the dozens and then by the hundreds, the crew of U-220 had already passed through the crucible together. They had formed something that could not easily be broken, a unit that would face the approaching catastrophe with the same discipline and quiet professionalism that Mohr had demanded from their first day aboard. The year 1944 opened with a calculation that Jochen Mohr could not ignore. The mathematics of submarine warfare had shifted beneath him, like the ocean currents that U-220 navigated each day, and the equation no longer favored the hunter. For nearly 2 years, German submariners had enjoyed a strategic advantage in the Atlantic, operating in waters where Allied defenses were fragmented, where convoy protection remained inconsistent, and where a skilled captain with patience and persistence could accumulate tonnage at rates that seemed to validate Berlin's gamble. That era was ending. By January, when Mohr was preparing for what would be his most dangerous operational cycle, the Allied response had matured into something far more formidable than the scattered opposition he had faced in 1943. The convoys came now with dedicated destroyer escorts, with converted corvettes bristling with newer sonar apparatus, with aircraft flying from escort carriers that had begun to close the so-called Black Pit, that terrible expanse of mid-Atlantic where no air cover had previously been possible. The supply situation in Germany meant that there could be no retreat from this challenge, no strategic pause to rebuild, no acknowledgement that the war at sea was becoming unwinnable. Mohr would conduct his patrols because that was his duty, but he understood in the careful calculations of a professional officer what the signs portended. The technological balance had fundamentally shifted against the U-boats by early 1944. The Allies had deployed high-frequency direction-finding equipment, known to the Germans as METOX, which could locate U-boats transmitting on certain radio frequencies. More devastating still was their acquisition of radar systems of increasing sophistication that could detect a U-boat on the surface at distances where the submarine had no warning of danger. The old tactics of surfacing at night to attack convoys, tactics that had worked so effectively for Mohr and others in 1942 and early 1943, were becoming suicidal. Surfacing meant exposure to detection, and detection meant the converging swiftly of superior force from multiple vectors. The Germans attempted to respond with new radar detection equipment of their own, with acoustic homing torpedoes that promised to strike back at escorts, and with improved diving qualities for their newer U-boats. But these innovations lagged behind the pace of Allied development, and the production capacity of Germany could not replace the mounting losses of U-boats and their experienced crews. For Mohr, this meant operating under constant constraint, hunting primarily submerged, attempting attacks from depth, and accepting far fewer opportunities to prosecute his trade. The Atlantic was becoming not a hunting ground but a killing field, and the submarine was increasingly the prey. The convoy defenses themselves had evolved into something resembling an integrated defensive network by the first months of 1944. Where Mohr had once encountered lone merchant ships or loosely organized convoys with minimal protection, he now found that every merchantman of consequence traveled within a protected formation screened by warships armed with improved weaponry and tactics. The British and American escort commanders, by early 1944, had decades of collective experience in anti-submarine warfare. They understood how submarines behaved, how they attacked, where they positioned themselves relative to convoys. The escort tactics had been refined through countless engagements, and the training of these warship crews had reached a level of proficiency that made each patrol a calculated risk, far exceeding the dangers Mohr had accepted in his breakthrough year. The convoy commodores coordinated evasive maneuvers with greater precision. The sonar operators in the escorts had learned to distinguish a U-boat's acoustic signature from natural ocean phenomena and from the false contacts that had previously consumed so much effort in pursuit of phantoms. American and Canadian escorts, in particular, had become aggressive and confident, willing to press attacks to the point of ramming if necessary to destroy a submarine detected in or near the convoy perimeter. For Mohr, the mathematics had become prohibitively difficult. To sink a convoy ship required positioning, required an opportunity to fire, required escape from the subsequent counterattack. Each element had become exponentially more difficult to achieve. The winter and spring of 1944 brought Mohr the confrontation with these new realities in vivid form. His patrols during this period yielded fewer opportunities to attack and a marked increase in encounters with well-coordinated hunter forces. U-220 conducted operations in the North Atlantic approaches, in areas south and west of Ireland where convoy routes converged, bringing together the accumulation of every technological advantage and tactical refinement the Allies had developed. When Mohr detected a convoy, the subsequent hours often unfolded with grim predictability. His attempt to position for an attack would be detected by sonar from escorting destroyers. The destroyer or corvette would turn toward the contact, and begin an aggressive approach. Mohr would be forced to dive deeper, to break off his approach, to put distance between U-220 and the pursuing escorts. By the time the escorts had fallen away, or the convoy had moved on, hours or even days would have passed, and another opportunity was lost. The frustration for men in a submarine, confined in a steel tube, knowing that enemy warships prowled above them with devices specifically designed to locate and destroy them, was immense and corrosive. Mohr maintained discipline, maintained focus, refused to allow despair to grip his crew or to cloud his judgment. But the objective reality was that his kill rate had begun to decline noticeably. The broader picture of U-boat losses accelerated with brutal momentum in early 1944. German Fleet Headquarters in Berlin conducted ongoing analysis of the campaign's trajectory, and the conclusions grew progressively darker as the winter months unfolded into spring. In January and February, U-boat losses reached levels that could not be sustained for more than a few months without destroying the entire submarine arm. The Germans sank Allied merchant tonnage at rates that would have been considered a triumph in 1942, but those sinkings came at a cost measured in submarines that was simply unsustainable. For every convoy that lost 3 or 4 merchantmen to a U-boat attack, Germany lost perhaps 2 or 3 submarines in the vicinity of that same convoy. The arithmetic of attrition favored the Allies absolutely. They could replace their merchant losses, could build new cargo vessels at startling rates, could sustain their supply lines even under harassment. Germany could not replace submarines fast enough to sustain operational strength against such losses. Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, understood this catastrophe with perfect clarity. His submarines were dying faster than shipyards could produce them. His experienced captains were being captured or killed, and his newer captains, trained hastily and with insufficient operational experience, were dying in U-boats they did not fully understand at rates that approached 90% losses in some patrols. Jochen Mohr's position in this collapsing strategic situation was that of a captain of significant experience and proven capability, which meant that his patrols were more likely to result in successful attacks, and his crew's survival was more probable than for many other U-boats operating in 1944. This was, in a way, a curse as much as a blessing, because Mohr had accumulated a record of sinkings, because he had demonstrated the tactical skill and nerve to survive patrols that killed other commanders. German Fleet Headquarters would continue to deploy him. There would be no reassignment to training duties, no role in developing tactics for a submarine arm being forced to fundamentally reimagine itself. Instead, there would be another patrol into the Atlantic, another desperate hunt through waters increasingly infested, with hunters more sophisticated and better organized than those he had faced before. Mohr accepted this with the professionalism that characterized everything he did as a naval officer. His duty was to conduct operations, to acquire targets, to sink enemy tonnage in service of the Nazi war effort. The likelihood of his own death, or the death of his crew, was a calculation that became less important as the war ground toward conclusion. The psychological impact of operating U-220 in early 1944 could not be overstated. Mohr's crew, many of whom had survived patrols with him through the height of the campaign in 1943, understood with absolute clarity that conditions had deteriorated. Men who had served in submarines since 1941 or 1942 brought with them memory of different times, when U-boats operated in conditions of relative superiority, when the return from patrol was more likely than death, when success could be measured in terms of tonnage, sunk, rather than survival itself. Now, as winter gave way to spring in 1944, that calculus had reversed. the probability of loss for any U-boat departing on patrol had risen to appalling levels. Young sailors joining U-220 as replacements for those lost or transferred received training that was rushed and incomplete by the standards of earlier in the war. The supply of veteran, experienced petty officers and specialists had begun to thin as casualties accumulated. Mohr maintained his own comportment with consistency, demonstrated competence, and refused to allow panic to infect his command. His first watch officer, his chief engineer, the senior non-commissioned officers, all looked to Mohr's steady demeanor for reassurance that they had a captain who would make calculated decisions, would not squander their lives in quixotic attacks, would attempt to bring U-220 and her crew home. This was the unspoken contract between captain and crew as the Atlantic War entered its final year of German involvement. The intelligence available to Mohr and other U-boat commanders deteriorated alongside the deterioration in operational conditions. German naval intelligence, which had provided valuable information about convoy movements and timing earlier in the war, had lost access to the British convoy route's deep secrets by early 1944. The British had been reading German radio traffic with increasing success, and Germany had become aware of this through various intelligence channels. The German Navy therefore became more circumspect in its radio transmissions, reducing the volume of information that could be passed to U-boats at sea. The result was that captains like Mohr increasingly operated with incomplete information, forced to rely more heavily on their own observations and the radio reports from other U-boats in their patrol areas. This made coordination more difficult, made it harder to position submarines ahead of convoy routes or to mass in wolf pack formations that had been so effective in 1942 and early 1943. Mohr adapted to this constraint with the flexibility that had always characterized his command, developing a methodical approach to patrol that emphasized careful search patterns and patient observation of the ocean around him. But patience is a virtue of lesser value when time itself is running out. When every day a submarine remains on patrol, increases the probability of detection and destruction. The enemy forces that Mohr encountered during 1944 patrols included not only the escort vessels protecting the convoys, but also dedicated anti-submarine forces operating independently. The Allies had begun to deploy hunter-killer groups, typically centered on a carrier with a screen of escort destroyers whose sole purpose was the location and destruction of German submarines. These groups operated with sophisticated coordination, with shared radar and sonar information, with aircraft that could conduct sustained hunts over areas where U-boats were suspected to be operating. Mohr had never faced anything quite like these integrated forces during his earlier patrols. An encounter with a hunter-killer group could mean many hours of evasion, of running from detection, of diving deeper than U-220 was designed to dive, of attempting to move away from the patrol area under conditions of extreme acoustic quietness that required the crew to halt nearly all machinery. The strain on the submarine's hull, the danger of reaching crush depth, the certainty that if the hunter-killer group stayed in the area long enough, they would eventually be detected. All of this created a tension that could not be adequately conveyed to men who had never served in submarines facing such circumstances. By spring of 1944, it became clear to Mohr that the Kriegsmarine strategy was undergoing a fundamental revision. The German Navy could no longer think in terms of large-scale offensive operations designed to cripple Allied supply lines. Instead, the U-boat arm was being repositioned toward a new tactical doctrine that emphasized attrition and interdiction, attempting to make convoy operations so costly for the Allies that they would divert resources and attention from other theaters. This was a defensive doctrine dressed in offensive language, a reflection of Germany's broader military position. The grand campaigns of 1942 and 1943, where Dönitz had deployed U-boat packs against major convoys and achieved sinkings that measured in the hundreds of thousands of tons monthly, had become impossible. Instead, each patrol was a desperate attempt to achieve any meaningful tactical success in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority. For Mohr, this meant that the context of his patrols had shifted fundamentally. He was no longer a brilliant submarine captain seeking to achieve a prestigious kill score in order to advance his career or to earn the recognition of his superiors. He was a professional naval officer attempting to conduct his duty under circumstances that were becoming increasingly desperate. The technological innovations that Germany attempted to introduce during this period offered some promise, but could not change the fundamental balance. The Schnorkel device, which allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged by snorkeling at periscope depth, promised to increase underwater speed and endurance. The NAT acoustic homing torpedo, which would seek out and attack convoy escorts rather than the merchant ships themselves, offered a way to reduce the threat from the defender. Newer U-boat classes with improved diving depth and faster underwater speed were beginning to enter service. But these innovations came too late, in insufficient numbers, and could not overcome the reality that Germany had lost the technological competition with the Allies. Each innovation the Germans introduced was met within months by a countering innovation from British or American laboratories. The intelligence war, fought in part between the engineers and tacticians of both sides, was decisively won by the Allies by early 1944. Mohr could not have known all the technical details of this competition, but he understood its practical implications. The advantage that submarines had possessed in the Atlantic through the early stages of the war had been surrendered. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunt itself was turning against Germany with each passing week. The human cost of this reversal became increasingly visible as spring progressed into early summer of 1944. The loss of established captains, men who had served with distinction and accumulated valuable knowledge through years of operations, struck at the heart of German submarine capability. These captains could not be replaced by simply promoting competent junior officers or cycling experienced men through rapid training programs. The development of a skilled submarine commander required years of accumulated experience, understanding of the psychological demands of command, knowledge of how different U-boat types behaved under various conditions. Germany was losing these men faster than they could be developed. For Mohr, each loss of a fellow captain in his U-boat flotilla or in other flotillas was a reminder of his own mortality, a recognition that his skill and weighed. The Atlantic in 1944 had become a different ocean. The waters that had once favored the hunter now turned against him with mechanical precision. By this point in his command, Jochen Mohr had already accumulated a respectable record, sinking enough tonnage to justify his position among Germany's capable submarine captains. But tonnage was becoming irrelevant. What mattered now was survival. What mattered was bringing the boat home, bringing the crew home, because the arithmetic of the war had shifted entirely in favor of those who hunted the hunters. The Allies no longer searched blindly for U-boats in the vastness of the Atlantic. They searched with radio direction, finding stations that triangulated transmissions across continents. They searched with centimetric radar that penetrated fog and darkness. They searched with aircraft carrying depth charges and homing torpedoes, with surface vessels equipped with sonar arrays that could detect a submarine's presence from ranges the German Navy had not anticipated 5 years earlier. Jochen Mohr understood this transformation at a visceral level, not from intelligence briefings or fleet memoranda, but from the narrowing of his operational window on each patrol, from the increasing frequency with which he encountered escort vessels, and from the sinking sensation that preceded each depth charge attack. The attack that nearly destroyed U-220 and killed its commander came without theatrical prelude. Mohr's boat was conducting a routine transit through waters southwest of Ireland when hydrophone operators detected the distinctive sound of a convoy's propulsion wash and escort vessel engines. This was familiar territory for Mohr by the latter half of 1944. A convoy meant opportunity, but it also meant danger in ratios that had inverted since his early patrols. The standing orders from fleet headquarters had long since ceased to recommend aggressive surface attacks against well-defended convoys. The new instructions emphasized stealth, selection of isolated targets, and immediate withdrawal if detected. Mohr had absorbed these lessons through hard experience and the losses of friends and fellow captains. He maneuvered U-220 to gain a favorable position, moving slowly through subsurface water layers where sound transmission was distorted by temperature gradients. The approach required patience and nerve. The periscope would have to be raised eventually, would have to break the surface briefly for the approach officer to assess the convoy's composition and course. This moment of exposure, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, represented a critical vulnerability. Any Allied ship with a competent lookout, any aircraft passing overhead, any surface vessel sweeping the horizon with radar might detect that thin shaft of steel and glass interrupting the water's surface. The approach went well initially. Mohr positioned his boat ahead of the convoy's projected course, allowing the merchant ships and their escorts to advance toward him, rather than pursuing them and burning fuel to chase targets that might outrun him. His crew worked with the efficiency that comes from repetition and training. The hydrophone operators guided the boat with constant updates on the convoy's bearing and distance. The navigation team plotted positions with dividers and charts, calculating intercept points and estimated attack times. The torpedo room crews checked their weapons one final time, ensuring the firing mechanisms were armed and the courses were set correctly. Everything moved with the precision of machinery operated by men who understood that mistakes were measured not in missed opportunities, but in casualties. Then the escort vessels detected U-220's periscope. The sighting report came by voice on the hydrophone circuit, transmitted between the escort ships through underwater signaling devices that German intelligence had identified but not adequately countered. Mohr ordered the periscope lowered immediately and began maneuvering for evasion, but he had already committed to the attack position. The boat's course was predictable. Its depth was limited by the need to maneuver below periscope depth without losing all situational awareness. The first depth charges fell from the sky without warning. Mohr had expected surface attacks, had prepared his crew for the acoustic assault of explosions detonating in the water around them, but the appearance of an anti-submarine aircraft changed the tactical situation instantaneously. The aircraft had detected U-220 on radar, had descended through cloud cover with experienced precision, and released a pattern of depth charges designed to bracket the submarine's estimated position. The impact was catastrophic, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so sudden and so violent. The first charge detonated roughly 50 meters from the port side of the hull, igniting the water into a violent column of churning foam and phosphorescence. The shock wave struck U-220 like a physical blow delivered by an unseen giant. Men were thrown from their stations. Equipment mounted on the walls tore loose from their brackets. The submarine's hull groaned under the pressure differential, metal screaming in protest as the acoustic shock wave propagated through the boat's interior. Mohr, gripping the chart table in the control room, felt the deck rise beneath him and then drop as the pressure wave passed. For an instant that seemed to stretch across minutes, he could not tell if the hull had breached, if his boat was sinking, if this was the moment his luck ended in the Atlantic's cold darkness. The second charge detonated closer, directly above the boat. The submarine's operational depth at this moment was approximately 100 meters, deep enough to provide some protection from the acoustic shock, but shallow enough that the pressure wave delivered nearly full force to the vessel. The U-220's structure was rated to withstand depth charge attacks to certain tolerances, but only when the boat's systems were undamaged and operating optimally. The damage control team discovered within seconds that the boat was taking water forward. A seam in the hull had sprung near the torpedo room. Not a catastrophic rupture, but a steady stream of cold Atlantic water pouring into spaces that were never meant to flood. At the same moment, reports came from the engine room that the starboard diesel engine had seized. The clutch mechanism that connected the diesel to the boat's electric motor had shattered under the shock wave. The shock wave had also damaged the electric junction boxes that routed current from the batteries to the motors. U-220 was no longer fully mobile. It could move, but only on battery power, and the boat's battery capacity was finite. With the diesel disabled, there was no way to recharge the batteries while submerged. The boat had become a sinking, wounded animal in a hunting ground swarming with predators. Mohr's response to this cascade of damage was neither panic nor hesitation. He ordered the boat deeper, below the layer where the aircraft's depth charges were most effective, accepting the greater pressure at depth as preferable to the certain death that awaited if he remained in the aircraft's attack envelope. The dive brought new creaks and groans from the hull, stress sounds that normally would have caused alarm, but which now seemed trivial compared to the incoming water. The crew in the torpedo room worked to shore up the damaged seam, using emergency wooden wedges and canvas patching material, a technique so primitive that it belonged to the age of sailing ships rather than modern naval warfare. These repairs were temporary at best, slowing the water's entrance, but not stopping it. Mohr maneuvered the boat to use the ocean's thermal layers for concealment, the boundaries between water masses of different temperatures that confused sonar returns and made the submarine harder to locate. The aircraft's radar could still find them if it returned to the surface area directly above, but the underwater acoustic searches became less effective as Mohr descended deeper and played the geometry of the thermal layers like a musician interpreting a complex score. He maintained absolute silence. All non-essential machinery was shut down. The ventilation system, normally running continuously to keep the boat's atmosphere breathable, was restricted to minimum flow. Men worked in near darkness except for the glow of emergency lighting, moving carefully to avoid the sounds that might betray their position to listening hydrophones above. The convoy, meanwhile, continued its transit above them. The escort vessels performed sonar sweeps, searching for the submarine they knew was somewhere in the vicinity, deploying additional depth charges in patterns designed to flush the boat or force it into areas where it could be more easily tracked. The explosions continued at irregular intervals, each detonation sending shock waves through the water that made the hull reverberate like a struck bell. The psychological impact on the crew was immense. Men who had served through multiple patrols, who had learned to accept the danger of submarine warfare as an occupational fact, were being tested at a level that exceeded standard operational stress. The wounded boat was sinking at a slow but measurable rate. The repair crews worked in teams to move water back through manual pumps, operations that required muscular effort and perfect coordination in spaces lit by nothing more than flashlights. The forward section of the submarine was becoming progressively flooded, spaces sealing behind watertight doors as the water advanced. These flooding procedures reduced the boat's operational volume, concentrated the crew into smaller spaces, increased the carbon dioxide levels in the breathable air, and created the constant awareness that each sealed compartment was a potential tomb. Mohr remained in the control room throughout the sustained attack, maintaining a tactical picture through the hydrophone operators and the sonar equipment that still functioned despite the damage. His role was not to work the pumps or to patch holes, but to make the decisions that would determine if U-220 and its crew survived this crisis. He had to judge how long the battery power would last at the reduced consumption rate now possible. He had to calculate when the freshwater batteries operating the remaining electrical systems would become exhausted. He had to determine when it would be necessary to attempt to surface and run the intact port diesel engine, a maneuver that would announce his position to every Allied ship and aircraft in the vicinity, but which was necessary to restore the capacity to charge the batteries and sustain the crew's ability to breathe. The attack continued for hours. The specific duration is difficult to establish from historical records, but crew accounts suggest that the sustained assault lasted somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, though time compressed and expanded strangely for the men enduring it. The noise of the explosions merged with the sound of water rushing through the damaged hull, the groans of the stressed structure, the voices of damage control teams calling out status updates, and the shallow breathing of men conserving oxygen in an atmosphere that was steadily becoming more contaminated with carbon dioxide and chemical byproducts from the batteries. The decision to surface came when Mohr realized that the batteries could sustain the boat's minimal operations for perhaps 2 more hours at the current depletion rate. After that, the boat would become a helpless hulk, incapable of maneuvering, unable to surface on its own power, destined to sink deeper until the pressure exceeded the hull's design tolerance and the submarine imploded. But surfacing also meant accepting the probability of being attacked immediately by whatever escort vessels remained in the vicinity, or by the aircraft that had initiated the assault. It meant exposing the damage to the hull, which was now no longer theoretical, but visible to anyone who saw the boat rise through the surface. It meant that the crew would have perhaps minutes to get the port diesel engine running and start the electrical charging system, before an escort vessel's guns or another depth charge volley ended the boat's existence. Mohr ordered the boat to prepare for emergency surface. The crew in the control room donned life jackets. The engineering team positioned themselves at the diesel controls, ready to fire up the engine the instant the boat broke the surface. The lookouts prepared to emerge through the conning tower hatch and scan the horizon for threats. The boat rose through the thermal layers, climbing through water increasingly illuminated by the fading daylight filtering down from above. At periscope depth, Mohr took one final observation. The convoy and its escorts were no longer in the immediate vicinity. The aircraft had apparently departed. The sustained attack had either driven the U-boat deep enough that the escorts had concluded it was destroyed, or they had turned their attention to other targets in the convoy system. Whatever the reason, the surface seemed temporarily clear. U-220 broke through in a cascade of foam and displaced water, the conning tower emerging first into the air and fading light of late afternoon. The lookouts clambered up through the hatch, scanning the horizon with practiced urgency for any sign of hostile vessels or aircraft. The port diesel roared to life almost immediately, a sound that must have seemed like salvation to every man in the boat. The engine's intake valves drew clean air from the atmosphere above, and the electrical generator began producing current to recharge the depleted batteries. But the engine had not emerged unscathed from the depth charge attack. It ran rough, missing occasionally, producing vibrations that were not consistent with a healthy mechanical system. The engineering team worked to smooth out the engine's operation, making minor adjustments to fuel flow and ignition timing, while simultaneously beginning to operate the charging system. The damage control parties shifted their focus from emergency response to systematic repair. The priority was sealing the breached hull to the greatest degree possible and establishing a more stable condition throughout the boat. The forward section would remain flooded, a permanent loss of operational space, but the flooding could be halted at the watertight door, and the boat could at least remain capable of operating with the aft sections intact. The journey back toward the French U-boat bases represented another kind of endurance test. U-220 could move, could charge its batteries, could sustain its crew, but only barely, and only temporarily. The starboard diesel remained seized and unusable. The hull damage created a structural weakness that meant the boat could never again dive to its full design depth. The electrical systems were damaged enough that full charging was not possible, leaving the boat perpetually dependent on running the port diesel at regular intervals to maintain battery capacity. Mohr navigated toward the nearest German-controlled port, moving as quickly as the damaged boat could manage, while attempting to avoid detection by Allied forces. The submarine that had been a dangerous predator, accumulating tonnage and earning recognition from fleet headquarters, had been transformed into a crippled refugee seeking the safety of harbor. The near loss of U-220 and the narrow escape from annihilation in the Atlantic represented more than a tactical survival. It demonstrated the complete reversal of the technological and tactical balance in the submarine war. The boat that had once hunted invulnerable in the depths, now hunted while hunted, fought to preserve itself while the men under its command struggled simply to breathe and to survive the next attack. This was the war in 1944. This was what had become of the U-boat arm that had once challenged British dominance and threatened to starve the Allied powers into submission. Mohr's skill and his crew's dedication had purchased survival on this patrol, but survival itself had become the only meaningful victory remaining in the Atlantic's dark and deepening waters. By early 1944, Jochen Mohr and the German U-boat arm faced a reality that no amount of tactical skill could reverse. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground where patient commanders stalked fat merchant convoys under relatively predictable conditions, had transformed into a graveyard. The statistics were unforgiving. In March alone, German submariners lost more than 40 U-boats to Allied forces, a rate of attrition that no industrial capacity could sustain. The waters that had promised Mohr his greatest achievements were now territories of systematic and overwhelming danger. The Admiralty in Berlin could still issue patrol orders, and commanders could still accept them with professional discipline, but the strategic foundation beneath those operations had collapsed. Germany's maritime strategy, which had always depended on strangling British commerce while preserving its own submarine force for a prolonged war of attrition, had become economically impossible. Mohr received his assignments knowing the odds had shifted against him with a finality that transcended any single captain's ability to alter through courage or cunning alone. The technological revolution in Allied anti-submarine warfare accelerated through the first half of 1944 with remorseless momentum. Aircraft equipped with centimetric radar could now detect U-boats at night on the surface, with an accuracy that rendered the submarine's traditional advantage obsolete. The escort vessels protecting convoys had multiplied in number and sophistication. Frigates and corvettes carried new detection equipment, improved depth charge patterns, and commanders trained specifically in anti-submarine tactics. The Allies had cracked the German naval codes months earlier, allowing convoys to be routed around known U-boat positions with uncanny precision. This intelligence advantage meant that Mohr might position U-220 according to Strategic Headquarters' assessment of convoy routes, only to discover empty seas where merchantmen should have been congregating. The psychological effect of this invisibility turned against the hunter was profound. Mohr had built his reputation on careful observation and patient positioning, yet increasingly his observations revealed nothing worth attacking, and his positions seemed to coincide with absence rather than opportunity. The hunters of the Atlantic had become the hunted, and the hunter's advantage in remaining unseen had evaporated entirely. Mohr's patrol in the spring of 1944 took him once again toward the American coastline, where U-boats had once found relatively undefended targets. The voyage outbound consumed days of travel through hostile waters at submerged depths, conserving battery power while maintaining alert watchfulness. The crew of U-220 had grown accustomed to these long silences broken by sudden, violent action. The machinists maintained their diesel engines with practiced efficiency during surface running periods, always alert for aircraft or surface vessels appearing suddenly on the horizon. The torpedomen kept their weapons ready, though everyone aboard understood that opportunities to fire them were becoming rarer. Food supplies diminished as the patrol extended, the cook stretching provisions across an ever-lengthening timeline, with the grim knowledge that patrol durations could stretch indefinitely if the U-boat had to avoid detection. The crew's morale remained professional rather than enthusiastic. These were men trained in a specific craft, executing a mission they did not control, understanding at a practical level that victory had become impossible, but their duty was not negotiable. On the American coast itself, Mohr found the merchant traffic had fundamentally changed. Where earlier in the war scattered ships had sailed nearly unescorted, now even smaller convoys moved under armed protection. The coastal waters bristled with American destroyers and Coast Guard cutters conducting intensive anti-submarine sweeps. Allied aircraft from land bases could now cover areas far out to sea, reducing the volume of water where U-boats might operate safely on the surface. Mohr achieved a limited success, sinking a merchant vessel that had strayed from protective formation, but the action brought immediate response from escort vessels. Depth charges churned the water above U-220 for hours, forcing Mohr to take his submarine deep and run quiet, using only passive listening equipment to track the escorts overhead. The explosion of charges nearby concussed through the hull with a force that set every man aboard on edge, testing not only his physical endurance but his absolute confidence in his commander's judgment. Mohr maintained the discipline of silence and stillness, knowing that any sound or movement could trigger another pattern of attacks. The escorts eventually moved on, but the encounter demonstrated how narrow Mohr's margin of success had become. A single merchant vessel, one at the cost of hours of danger and fuel consumption, was no longer sufficient to justify extended Atlantic patrols. Yet the patrols continued because the Admiralty in Berlin continued to order them, because every commander was expected to maintain professional obligation regardless of circumstances. The transition in Mohr's tactical approach, which had been evident even in his successful patrols of 1943, became pronounced now in 1944. Rather than aggressive hunting that exposed U-220 to concentrated defensive fire, Mohr increasingly employed evasion and careful positioning. He would locate a convoy through listening equipment or visual observation, then carefully approach from a direction that minimized exposure to escorts. If the tactical situation appeared disadvantageous, he would shadow the convoy at a distance, waiting for a moment when the geometry of positions favored attack with minimal risk. This approach meant fewer merchant vessels sunk per patrol, but fewer casualties within the crew, and a higher probability of bringing U-220 safely home. Some commanders viewed this as excessive caution, yet Mohr's assessment of the changed circumstances proved strategically sound. Commanders who maintained aggressive tactics during 1944 did achieve occasional successes, but the vast majority of them did not survive the year. Mohr's methodical approach, which had sometimes earned him criticism for insufficient aggressiveness early in the war, became the dominant survival strategy as the U-boat arm contracted. The burden of command intensified for Mohr as he watched the U-boat losses accumulate around him with terrible consistency. Commanders he had known through training flotillas and shared harbor facilities were lost without news of their final moments. The submarines they commanded simply failed to return from patrol. The Admiralty would note them in operation logs as missing, presumed lost, and soon enough, the reality of their destruction would be confirmed through intelligence or deduction. Mohr understood that U-220's continued operation was partially an accident of circumstance. Better armed escorts, worse luck with convoy positioning, a moment's lapse in attention during a critical phase of an attack, and the vessel would have followed the others to the bottom. The men aboard his submarine knew this as well. The petty officers and ratings who had joined U-220 as recent recruits and had grown into experienced submariners through patrols, watched the overall picture with cold understanding. They executed their duties with technical precision because professionalism was all that remained when the broader strategic situation offered no encouragement. Mohr's later patrols of 1944 showed diminishing returns in concrete terms of merchant tonnage, sunk, while maintenance and crew fatigue mounted. One patrol in the summer yielded a single merchant vessel, damaged but not sunk, before Mohr correctly assessed that continued pursuit would bring overwhelming escort response. He withdrew, conserved fuel and supplies, and returned to base with a modest loss in tonnage, but an intact crew and a submarine capable of future operations. To the metrics of admirals counting total tonnage sunk across the entire U-boat fleet, this represented failure or wasted effort. To the men aboard U-220, and to Mohr himself, it represented professional judgment executed correctly under circumstances where misjudgment meant death. The war's calculus had inverted entirely. Early in the conflict, sinking merchant ships was the measure of success because it served the strategic goal of strangling British commerce. By 1944, maintaining the U-boat fleet's existence and keeping experienced commanders alive had become the only realistic objective, though no official declaration would state this directly. The physical condition of U-220 began to show the strain of extended operations. The submarine had completed multiple patrols across more than a year of active service, conducting dives and emergency maneuvers that stressed the hull and mechanical systems beyond their design tolerances. The diesel engines required increasingly extensive maintenance. The electric motors, which powered the submarine during underwater running, had been cycled through charge and discharge so many times that their capacity had degraded. The hull itself bore the pressure of deep dives and the concussion of nearby explosions. Mohr ensured that every available repair facility worked on his command during brief periods in port, but the fundamental reality remained that U-220 was an aging vessel in a fleet that had no resources for systematic renewal. Modern submarines were still being built and commissioned, but attrition far exceeded production. The German shipyards, themselves under increasing Allied bombing, could not replace the losses. Mohr had to operate U-220, knowing that his vessel was becoming progressively less capable and more likely to malfunction at a critical moment. The psychological weight of these patrols accumulated in ways that affected every man aboard differently. Some crew members developed nervous habits or showed signs of the strain that submariners called the pressure sickness, an affliction that manifested in irritability, loss of appetite, and difficulty sleeping in the cramped conditions. Mohr recognized these symptoms and did what he could to maintain morale through small gestures of consideration and by ensuring that rest periods were as complete as circumstances allowed. He did not address the hopelessness of the situation directly, but he acknowledged it implicitly through his tactical restraint and his willingness to abort attacks when the risk exceeded any reasonable expectation of success. The crew respected his competence and his willingness to keep them alive, even when this meant returning from patrol with limited tactical success. This respect was different from the admiration some crews felt toward more aggressive captains who achieved higher tonnage scores. It was the respect of men who understood that their commander valued their lives and would not waste them for glory or for approval from headquarters. During the autumn of 1944, the strategic situation deteriorated further, with the Allies' successful consolidation of their position in France and their continued expansion of naval operations into areas previously considered German territory. The Atlantic itself remained contested, but the volume of submarine-safe waters continued to contract. Mohr received orders for a patrol in the North Atlantic toward Greenland, a region where ice and weather provided some protection from aircraft operations, but where convoys were fewer and farther between. The voyage itself tested U-220 and her crew severely. Ice formations presented hazards to navigation. The water temperature approached levels where a sailor overboard would not survive more than minutes. The crew worked under conditions of extreme cold and discomfort, their breath visible in the compartments even when the submarine was operating. Mohr guided the vessel with meticulous attention to both navigation and the presence of Allied search patterns. The crew achieved one successful attack on a merchant vessel, a modest triumph that provided some morale benefit and validation of their continued mission. The patrol lasted weeks longer than anticipated because weather prevented reliable passage homeward, extending the supply situation to near critical levels. The final patrols of 1944 for Mohr and U-220 were characterized by a quietness that contrasted with the intensity of the earlier successes. Long days passed without sighting any merchant vessel at all. The submarine would surface briefly to charge batteries and replenish air, then submerge again into the depths where Mohr would listen passively for the sounds of distant convoys. Sometimes he heard them, but could not maneuver into effective position. Sometimes the detection equipment would transmit the unmistakable sound of merchant ship engines and escort vessels in formation, and Mohr would calculate whether attack was possible or whether discretion required withdrawing to avoid detection. The mathematics of submarine warfare had become impossibly constrained. Risk of detection had become nearly certain if attack was attempted. Success was unlikely even if attack was launched. The only reliable outcome was the possibility of U-220's destruction. Against this calculus, Mohr repeatedly chose conservation, withdrawal, and preservation. He would maneuver to a position of tactical advantage, observe the convoy structure, and escort dispositions, and then decide that attack would exceed acceptable risk. These decisions represented a transformation from the aggressive hunter of 1943 to a professional who had learned that survival itself had become victory. By the year's end, Jochen Mohr had accumulated a record that placed him among the recognized U-boat commanders, but not among the handful of highest-scoring aces. His total tonnage sunk placed him in a middle rank, a significant achievement, but far below the totals claimed by the war's legendary submariners. Yet he possessed something equally valuable by late 1944. His crew was intact, his submarine remained operational, and he had demonstrated the tactical judgment necessary to continue functioning in an environment where most commanders and their vessels had been destroyed. The strategic situation had become so thoroughly reversed that professional competence meant something entirely different from what it had meant a year earlier. Mohr had adapted to circumstances that could not be controlled, maintaining discipline and effectiveness in an operation that no longer served any strategic purpose beyond the requirement to continue fighting. U-220 would continue on patrol into 1945, but the era of meaningful U-boat operations was closing. The Atlantic would soon become a place where only German submarines, still fighting for tactical success or testing new weapons, remained. A scattered, dying fleet, operating on momentum and obligation rather than any realistic hope of altering the war's outcome. The German U-boat fleet in 1944 stood at a crossroads between mythic domination and systematic extinction. The wolf pack, that coordinated hunting formation that had ravaged Allied convoys across the Atlantic, was becoming a memory. What had once been hailed as an unstoppable weapon of submarine warfare now faced an enemy equipped not merely with ships and depth charges, but with something far more devastating: the ability to see the invisible. By the early months of 1944, the Kriegsmarine's proud submariners found themselves navigating an ocean that had been mapped by their enemies with terrifying precision. The Allies had cracked the German naval enigma codes months earlier, meaning that every patrol route, every rendezvous point, every Wolfpack assembly order was known to British and American intelligence before the U-boats had even left port. This intelligence advantage, combined with revolutionary advances in radar, sonar, and coordinated anti-submarine tactics, had tilted the entire Atlantic War in ways that no amount of German courage or tactical skill could overcome. The Wolfpack system itself, the very concept that had made the German submarine arm so lethal, became a liability. The coordination signals required to assemble multiple submarines around a convoy, to share targeting information, and to mass attack were all transmitted by radio. Those transmissions were intercepted, decrypted, and acted upon by Allied hunter-killer groups that could now converge on U-boat positions with overwhelming speed and precision. In 1943, the Germans had suffered dramatic losses. The dreadful month of May alone had seen more than 40 U-boats destroyed. Yet Gross-Admiral Karl Dönitz had continued the Wolfpack offensive with characteristic determination. He believed that the U-boats remained Germany's only viable strategic weapon, the only means by which the nation could strangle British supply lines and prevent American reinforcements from reaching Europe. But by 1944, that belief had become tragically decoupled from reality. The arithmetic of attrition had turned catastrophic. For every merchant vessel sunk, the Germans were losing submarines they could never replace. The shipyards could build new hulls, but they could not produce experienced commanders or trained crews, and those resources were bleeding away at an unsustainable rate. Jochen Mohr, commanding U-220, existed within this deteriorating strategic landscape. He was a professional officer, aware of the mounting odds, yet bound by duty to continue operations. Unlike some U-boat captains who had grown rich in tonnage and decorations during 1943, Mohr had accumulated his kills through careful calculation rather than reckless aggression. This methodical temperament served him better than the tactics of others in the spring and summer of 1944, when aggressive patrol profiles brought swift death. The commanders who had survived 1943 by being fortunate or skilled now found their luck exhausted. Experienced captains began to be lost with startling frequency, not always in dramatic battles against escorts, but in sudden, overwhelming attacks where Allied air superiority and coordinated task forces gave them no opportunity to maneuver or escape. Mohr watched from the radio room and officers' wardroom as the composition of the U-boat fleet changed. Fresh-faced replacements arrived for patrols, many of them in their first command, lacking the experience to navigate an ocean where the hunter had become the hunted across nearly every degree of latitude. The technological equation had shifted so thoroughly that German engineers could barely comprehend the scope of the challenge they faced. Allied vessels were now equipped with centimetric radar, equipment that operated at wavelengths so short that German submarines had no reliable means of detecting the transmissions until the escort ship was nearly upon them. The British and Americans had also deployed high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could locate a U-boat merely by intercepting its radio signals, even if the U-boat remained submerged and out of visual range. These tools, combined with improved depth charges, Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, and coordinated team tactics, meant that a lone U-boat, or even a small wolf pack, could find itself under attack from multiple vectors simultaneously. The Kriegsmarine attempted to counter these developments with new technology, the snorkel apparatus that allowed diesel engines to operate while submerged, the acoustic homing torpedoes that promised to strike back at escorts. But these innovations arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the fundamental balance. By the time new equipment could be fitted to U-boats, the Allies had already developed countermeasures or had overwhelmed German defenses through sheer numeric and technical superiority. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound and cumulative. In 1941 and 1942, when the wolf packs achieved spectacular success against weakly defended convoys, U-boat service had carried a certain prestige within the Kriegsmarine hierarchy. Young sailors volunteered for submarine duty, believing they were serving in an elite formation. By 1944, the psychological reality had transformed into something altogether grimmer. Crews boarding a U-boat for patrol carried no illusions about their prospects. They knew the casualty rates. They understood that the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and the Atlantic had become graveyards for German submarines. The veteran submariners who survived attempted to maintain morale and unit cohesion, but the toll of repeated patrols, near-death experiences, and the loss of friends and comrades in other U-boats wore upon even the most stoic sailors. Mohr, commanding U-220, carried responsibility for the psychological state of his crew. He maintained the formalities of naval discipline and encouraged confidence in his tactical judgment. But beneath the surface, protocols ran currents of anxiety that no amount of professional composure could entirely conceal. The collapse of the wolf pack as a coordinated system accelerated through 1944. Dönitz, desperate to sustain the campaign against mounting losses, attempted to reorganize and adapt. New patrol formations were created, concentrated in areas where intelligence suggested the Allies might be weak or distracted. But the intelligence advantage possessed by the Allies, flowing from ultra-decryption of German naval signals, meant that these redeployments were often anticipated and countered. German submarines found themselves directed into patrol boxes where they encountered prepared defenses rather than unsuspecting convoys. The loss rate continued its dreadful climb. By mid-year, the Kriegsmarine was losing U-boats faster than shipyards could produce them. Dönitz faced a choice between abandoning the Atlantic campaign and accepting casualties at levels that approached suicide. He chose to continue operations, believing that maintaining pressure on the Allies, even at terrible cost, served some strategic purpose. The morale of U-boat crews, already fragile, began to show signs of fracturing under this accumulating pressure. Some captains began to question whether continued attacks were morally justified when the probability of their own survival and their crew's survival had become vanishingly small. Jochen Mohr operated within this context of systemic decline. His patrols in 1944, though still competent and dangerous, occurred within a fundamentally different operational environment than those of the previous year. The convoys were now more heavily defended, often escorted by American escort carriers equipped with dedicated anti-submarine aircraft. The waters of the Atlantic, once offering relative safety at depth, had become dangerous at all depths. Depth charges fell from surface escorts. Sonobuoys broadcast acoustic signals seeking U-boat propeller noise, and aircraft appeared from unexpected quarters to illuminate the ocean surface with searchlights and deliver attacks with bombs and machine gun fire. Mohr adapted to these conditions with the professionalism that characterized his entire service record. He maintained alert crews, maximized the use of available cover and darkness, and exercised caution in approaching targets that might be bait or traps. His crews, recognizing his competence and his concern for their survival, continued to follow his orders with discipline and confidence. But even the best tactics and the most capable captain could not entirely overcome the harsh arithmetic of a naval war in which every encounter with the enemy carried the potential for catastrophic loss. The dissolution of coordinated wolfpack operations fundamentally altered the tactics available to individual U-boat commanders. In 1943, the system had allowed submarines to receive radio, directing them toward convoys, to assemble in coordinated groups, and to attack in succession against escorts that were overwhelmed by numbers. By 1944, this system had become suicidal. Radio transmissions brought Allied hunter-killer groups down upon the U-boats that transmitted them. Attempts to assemble U-boats in wolf packs resulted in organized American and British task forces converging on the assembly points with devastating effect. The U-boat arm, forced to adapt or perish, gradually shifted toward independent operations where possible. Submarines would continue to patrol assigned sectors and to report sightings of convoys, but the expectation of support from other U-boats or coordination with higher command became increasingly unrealistic. This shift represented a profound change in German naval strategy, driven not by doctrine but by the brute force of Allied superiority. The submarines that had once hunted in coordinated packs, sharing intelligence and supporting one another's attacks, now operated as lone predators in hostile waters. The psychological impact of this transition cannot be understated. Submariners understood that isolation increased their danger. The solidarity and mutual protection that had been inherent in wolfpack tactics had provided a psychological anchor even when material conditions were grim. The transition to solitary operations stripped away that anchor without providing any compensating advantage. By the later months of 1944, the operational landscape had transformed so thoroughly that some U-boat commanders began to question whether continued offensive operations served any strategic purpose at all. The tonnage of shipping sunk by German submarines had declined precipitously from the peaks of 1942 and 1943. American shipbuilding capacity was producing merchant vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. The convoy system, perfected through years of evolutionary warfare, proved far more resilient than any German projection had anticipated. Even as the U-boats succeeded in sinking individual merchantmen, the flow of supplies